He hit her in front of everyone. Not a shove, not a grab. A full open-handed slap across the face of his wife. In the middle of a ballroom filled with 500 people who all went completely silent the second his palm connected with her cheek. Elena Vale didn't scream. She didn't crumble. She stood there with her champagne glass still in her hand, her head turned from the force of the blow, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that room breathed. Then she turned back and looked straight at him. And Dante Moretti, a man who had ordered people buried in concrete, who had bent senators and judges to his will, actually took one small step backward. He didn't know what she was. Not yet. But he was about to find out. If someone hit you like that, in front of the world, what would you do? Stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss what happens next. Because this one goes places you will not see coming. Hit the like button, drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from, and let's see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the night everything changed. The invitation had said black tie optional, which in Dante Moretti's world meant that every man in the room wore a tuxedo regardless of personal preference, because Dante himself wore one, and nobody in his orbit made choices that contradicted his. That was the thing about Dante. The rule was never written down. You just understood it. You understood it the way you understood gravity, the way you understood that certain doors in certain buildings stayed locked, and you did not ask what was on the other side. You understood it because the men who hadn't understood it weren't around anymore to explain where they'd gone wrong. The Whitmore Ballroom on the 43rd floor of the Hargrove Tower was one of those places that existed specifically to make money feel like something more than money. High ceilings with recessed lighting that kept everything golden and slightly soft. Round tables with white linens and low centerpieces so that no flower arrangement blocked anyone's sightline to anyone else. A stage at the far end where a string quartet played something European and forgettable. The annual Manhattan Children's Medical Foundation Gala drew 500 people every November, and every November Dante Moretti bought the most expensive table in the room and sat at it like a man who had paid for something he couldn't openly name, which, in a sense, he had. The foundation's board included 3 men whose legal problems had quietly disappeared in the last 4 years. Their gratitude expressed itself in access, to donor lists, to city officials, to the kind of casual social proximity that kept Dante's name clean enough to appear in newspaper society columns without triggering a federal inquiry. It was the sort of arrangement that required maintenance, which was why Dante came every year, drank moderately, smiled at people he despised, and kept his wife at his elbow like an accessory he'd selected for the occasion. Elena Moretti, born Elena Vale, had learned to move through these evenings the way you move through a room where someone has spilled something and not cleaned it up. Carefully, with full attention to where you were placing your feet. She was 34. She had dark hair she wore up for events like this, and she had her father's eyes, a particular shade of gray that people described as cold until they spent any real time in a conversation with her, at which point they usually revised that description to something more like precise. She was not beautiful in the way that required effort to notice. She was beautiful in the way that made men adjust their behavior without fully understanding why. Dante had married her 6 years ago. He had believed, in the particular way that men like Dante believe things, that he had acquired her. That a Vale daughter with a father in voluntary European exile and a family name that no longer carried the financial weight it once had was a woman who needed what he was offering. Safety, status. A certain kind of security that came wrapped in things you didn't examine too closely. He had not been entirely wrong about her situation. He had been catastrophically wrong about everything else. The evening had started the way those evenings always started. Cocktail hour on the terrace. Introductions to people whose names Elena already knew and whose financials she had already reviewed. Small conversations about art and real estate and the particular theater of charitable giving that wealthy people performed for each other at events like this. Dante circled the room with his consigliere, Marco Battiste, at his shoulder. Marco, who was 61 years old and moved like a man who had broken his left knee at some point and said it himself, while Elena accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and found herself standing beside a woman named Patricia Holt, whose husband sat on the city council, and whose husband had no idea that his campaign finance records had been in Elena's possession for 8 months. "You look tired," Patricia said, with the particular sincerity of someone who finds tiredness in other women vaguely satisfying. "Long week," Elena said. "Dante keeping you busy?" "Something like that." Patricia moved on to someone more interesting, and Elena stood alone for 40 seconds, which was 40 seconds she used to watch Dante across the room. He was laughing at something someone had said. A real laugh, not the performance kind. She knew the difference by now. When Dante laughed for real, his left hand always moved to his jacket lapel, a habit so old and unconscious she doubted he knew he did it. She knew almost everything about him by now. That was the problem. That was also the plan. The transition to dinner happened the way it always happened at these events. A gentle, invisible pressure applied by the event staff that guided 500 people from standing with drinks to sitting with place cards. And within 20 minutes, the room had reorganized itself into the configuration the foundation seating committee had spent 2 weeks perfecting. Dante's table was the third from the stage, which was close enough to be prominent, but not so close that the speeches were directly in your ear. Elena sat to Dante's right. Marco sat across from them. The remaining 4 seats at the table were filled by 2 city officials whose names appeared regularly in Dante's more careful conversations, and their wives, who spent most of the meal talking to each other about a renovation project in the Hamptons. Dinner proceeded. The first course came. The second course came. The speeches from the Foundation's board began at 8:15 and ran until 8:50, which was about 12 minutes longer than they should have, judging by the subtle posture shifts that Elena tracked around the room. Then, somewhere between the removal of the main course plates and the arrival of dessert, something changed. It started small. It started with a phone. Dante's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at it with the practiced casualness of a man who had spent 30 years conducting business in rooms where conducting business was theoretically inappropriate. His face shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that most people at the table would have noticed, but Elena noticed. The muscles around his jaw tightened. His left hand moved off the table. He typed a reply. The phone buzzed again almost immediately. He read it. Then he looked at Elena. She had been watching him. She didn't pretend otherwise. When their eyes met, he held the look for 2 seconds longer than he needed to, and she felt the particular quality of that look, the one that meant something had gone wrong somewhere, and he had decided before any evidence had been gathered that she was connected to it. She had felt that look before. The first time 3 years ago, she hadn't understood what it meant. The second time, she had understood but hadn't had enough of a foundation to respond to it. By now, she understood it completely. And she had spent the last 8 months making sure that when it finally escalated past a look, she was standing on solid ground. "Excuse me," she said, placing her napkin on the table and pushing her chair back. "Sit down," Dante said, quietly, conversationally, almost. "I'll be right back." "Elena." Not loud, not a scene, just a single syllable pressed flat, stripped of any inflection except the one that meant, "I am not asking." She had sat back down. She had sat back down because this was still a public room, and because the ground she was standing on, while more solid than it had ever been, required 3 more days to fully set. She had sat back down because she knew the difference between a battle and the war, and she had always understood that the war was what mattered. She had also sat back down because she was afraid of him. She had been afraid of him for 4 years. Not in the acute cinematic way, not the terror of immediate physical danger, though that had been part of it in the early years. The fear had evolved into something more ambient, something woven into the everyday texture of her life. The particular calibration of her own behavior to his moods. The preemptive self-editing. The way she heard his car in the driveway and felt her shoulders change before she was even consciously aware she'd heard it. She hated that fear more than she hated anything else, more than she hated him. She sat. She picked up her dessert fork. She pretended to be interested in the chocolate something that had appeared in front of her. Dante's phone buzzed again. He read the screen. He put the phone down. He picked up his wine glass, finished what was in it, set it down with a small, precise movement that she recognized as controlled anger. Marco was watching him. The 2 city officials were absorbed in a conversation about highway contracts. Their wives were still discussing the Hamptons renovation. "Who did you talk to this week?" Dante said. Not a question. "I talked to a lot of people," Elena said. "Who did you talk to about Fenwick?" The name landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripple of it move outward. She kept her face completely neutral. She had been practicing that face for 6 years, and she was, by now, extraordinarily good at it. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. "Don't." One word. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his empty wine glass. "Don't do that thing where you act like you don't understand the question." "I'm not acting like anything. I genuinely don't know what you're—" "The Fenwick account." He still wasn't looking at her. "The one that doesn't appear on any paperwork you've had access to. The one that 3 of my people have told me someone has been asking about through back channels." Now he turned. Now he looked at her directly. "Someone with a particular way of asking questions." The room was loud enough that their conversation was completely private. That was the thing about ballrooms. The ambient noise of 500 people eating and talking and laughing created a kind of sound insulation at any individual table. Marco was watching them now. She could see him in her peripheral vision, watching the way a man watches a situation he has seen precursors to before. "Dante," she said, "this is not the place. You think I care about the place." His voice was still low, still controlled. But there was something underneath it that had changed in the last 30 seconds, something that had come loose from its anchor. "You think I care about any of these people?" "You should. Some of them are important to you." "You are not in a position to tell me what's important to me." He was leaning toward her slightly. She could smell the wine on his breath and beneath it the cologne he had worn every day for as long as she had known him. Something that smelled expensive and vaguely marine, something she had once found attractive before she understood the man wearing it. She didn't move back. Moving back with Dante was never the right strategy. "Lower your voice," she said. "I'm not raising my voice." "You're about to." And that was it. That was the thing she shouldn't have said, because it was accurate. And accurate was sometimes the most dangerous kind of thing to say to a man who was losing his grip on something. She watched the accuracy of it land on him and become, in the landing, something he couldn't absorb, something that had to go somewhere else. His hand moved. It moved faster than she expected. That was the thing about Dante. Even after 6 years, even knowing his patterns, even having cataloged his behavior with the methodical attention of someone building a case, he could still move faster than she was braced for. The slap was open-palmed, full force, and it turned her head hard to the left. She heard it more than she felt it for the first 2 seconds. The sharp crack of it cutting through the ambient noise of the room, the momentary hitch in the string quartet as the musician nearest to them registered the sound. Then the feeling arrived. The heat, the sting moving from the surface of her skin down into the bone of her jaw. The room had gone quiet. Not completely. Nothing was completely silent with 500 people in it. But there was a sudden, obvious drop in the sound level, like a wave pulling back before it crashed. She was aware of faces turning toward their table. She was aware of Marco going completely still. She was aware of the 2 city officials having stopped mid-sentence. She did not cry. She did not make a sound. She touched her cheek with 2 fingers, not to comfort herself, not from shock, but because she wanted to know exactly how hard he'd hit her, to take a physical measurement of it, the way you take a measurement of anything you're going to use later. Then she lifted her eyes and looked straight at Dante. He was already recovering. She could see it happening in real time. The micro-expression of something adjacent to panic, there and gone in under a second, replaced by the particular reconstruction of his face that meant he was deciding what version of this moment he was going to present to the people watching. He straightened. He adjusted his jacket. He made the choice to present it as nothing, as something domestic and minor and beneath comment. "Elena," he started. She pushed her chair back. She stood. She picked up her clutch from the table. She did it with the same deliberate, unhurried movement she would have used if she were simply stepping away to take a phone call, and that deliberateness was more devastating than any display of emotion would have been, because it said, to every person in that room who was watching, that this was not a surprise, that she had a plan for this. She walked away from the table. Behind her, she heard Dante say something to Marco. Low, clipped. She didn't turn around. She kept her pace even, her spine straight, her chin at the precise angle that her mother had described to her once as the family default, meaning the face the Veils put on when the world was testing them. She walked through the tables and the turned heads, and the silence that was still echoing through the room like the sound wave from something detonated underground. She pushed through the door at the side of the ballroom and stood in the corridor beyond it. Service corridor, slightly too bright, smelling of linen starch and warming trays. And she stood there for exactly 30 seconds. Then she took out her phone. She had a message already waiting. It had arrived at 8:47, 4 minutes ago, while she'd been sitting at the table watching Dante read whatever had made him angry. The message was from a number that appeared in her contacts as a maintenance company name, a small operational security measure that had been in place for 2 years. The message read, "He's here. Ground level, ready when you are." She pressed her fingers flat against her cheek. The heat was already radiating through her jaw and into the side of her skull. It was going to bruise. She knew the geography of his slaps by now. She had taken 3 in 6 years, and each one had left a bruise that faded within a week, and each one had been followed by a version of accountability that never quite reached the level of the word itself. Not this time. She typed back, 10 minutes, west entrance. She put the phone in her clutch. She looked at the wall across from her, plain institutional white, a fire extinguisher mounted in a red case. And she let herself have 20 seconds of something that wasn't quite composure. 20 seconds where her hands weren't entirely steady, and her breathing did something complicated, and her eyes did the thing that eyes do when they're deciding whether or not to produce tears. She decided against the tears. She had made that decision 4 years ago, and she had not reversed it since. Then she went back in, not back to the table. She didn't go back to the table. She went to the far side of the ballroom, near the windows that looked out over the midtown skyline, and she accepted a glass of water from a server who looked at her cheek and then looked carefully away. She stood near the windows and watched the room with the specific attentiveness she'd developed over years of understanding that information lived in behavior, not words. Dante was back at the table. He was talking. The 2 city officials were listening, or performing listening, with the particular blankness of men who had just witnessed something they needed to categorize before they decided what it meant. Marco was scanning the room, looking for her, she knew. Marco always looked for her when Dante had done something, the same way you looked for a structural problem in a wall after you'd heard something crack in the ceiling. She watched him find her. Their eyes met across the room. Marco had worked for Dante for 22 years. She had never been entirely sure how Marco filed her in his accounting of the situation, whether she was a liability or an asset or simply a complication that required regular monitoring. What she was sure of was that Marco was smart enough to understand, on some level, that tonight had changed something. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he looked away. At 9:02, the west entrance doors of the ballroom opened. Victor Vale walked in. He was 68 years old, and he walked the way men walk, when they have never in their adult life needed anything from any room they've entered. Not approval, not acknowledgement, not the social oxygen that other people required. He was tall, gray-haired, dressed in a dark suit that was expensive in the way that didn't announce itself. He was not accompanied by security, which was either because he didn't need it or because he had arranged it so that you wouldn't see it. Elena suspected both were true. People noticed him. That was the thing about Victor Vale. He had a quality of presence that registered on a room whether or not you knew who he was. And in this particular room, enough people knew who he was to create a small, spreading ripple of recognition. She watched it move through the crowd, watched people recalibrate, watched heads turn. Victor walked directly toward Dante's table. He was carrying a folder, black, legal size, unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd see in any office. Elena watched Dante notice it, watched the folder register on Dante's face the way an unfamiliar sound registers in a dark room, not immediately alarming, but requiring attention. Victor stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at Dante. "Mr. Moretti," Victor said. He had a particular way of pronouncing names, not slowly, not for emphasis, but with a kind of completeness that suggested the name was being filed correctly for future reference. Dante set down his wine glass. "Victor Vale." He said it the way you say something when you're buying time. "I thought you were in Rome." "I was," Victor said. "What brings you to Manhattan?" "You hit my daughter." Victor said it in the same register, conversational, unhurried, in the tone you use when you're describing something that happened rather than something you're reacting to. "In front of 500 people." He set the folder on the table. "So here I am." The 2 city officials had stopped performing conversation. Their wives had gone very still. Marco was watching Victor Vale with the concentrated attention of a man trying to assess something that has no precedent in his experience. Dante looked at the folder, then at Victor. "What's that?" "A beginning," Victor said. "You want to have this conversation at the table, or you want to find somewhere private? Your choice. But we're having it tonight." Dante looked at the folder again. He did not touch it. Elena, from across the room, watched her husband's face do something complicated. Watched the pride and the paranoia and the calculation all surface at once, and then submerge again behind the particular mask he wore when he was deciding how much of a threat something was. He stood. "Private," he said. "Good," Victor said. And Elena, standing near the windows with her glass of water and her bruised cheek and 8 months of carefully assembled evidence, watched her father walk her husband out of the ballroom. Victor didn't look at her on the way out. He didn't need to. They had talked this through many times, the contingency, the timing, the specific conditions under which tonight's version of it would unfold. She had not predicted the slap. She had predicted everything around it with remarkable precision, but she had not predicted that specifically, not on this night. She had known it was coming eventually. The escalation from verbal to physical had been a pattern she had watched building for 2 years, like a weather system organizing itself. But she had not known it would be tonight, in this room, in front of these specific people. She thought, standing there, that she should feel something more cinematic, more resolved. She had read about this in the psychological literature. The moment when the thing you have been preparing for finally happens, and the preparation becomes real, and you discover whether what you've built is solid or whether it collapses under the weight of the actual event. What she felt was tired. A bone-level exhaustion that had nothing to do with the hour and everything to do with the amount of time she had been holding herself at a particular kind of readiness. And underneath the tiredness, something that was beginning to feel, cautiously and with significant qualification, like relief. She set the water glass down on the nearest table. She followed her father and her husband out of the ballroom. The room in which the three of them assembled was a small hospitality suite 2 floors below the ballroom, a room that the foundation used for VIP staging during the event, and that was, at this hour, empty except for a round table, several chairs, a half-eaten cheese board, and a bar cart that nobody was going to use. Victor had clearly arranged access in advance, another thing she had not predicted precisely, but that made complete sense in retrospect. Victor sat. Dante did not. He stood near the bar cart with his hands at his sides, and the particular posture of a man who has decided to demonstrate that he is not threatened by the situation, while simultaneously demonstrating, in every physical detail, exactly how threatened he is. Elena sat across from her father. "Start talking," Dante said. Victor opened the folder. He didn't remove anything from it yet. He looked at the first page, then at Dante. "How long have you been running the Fenwick routing through the Calumet holding?" Dante said nothing. 14 months, Victor said. "You shifted it because the previous structure had 2 points of exposure that you couldn't close. The Calumet routing solved the immediate problem. It created a different one." He turned a page. "You didn't know about the different one." "How do you know about Calumet?" Dante said. "Because Elena told me," Victor said, "about 8 months ago." The room was very quiet. Elena watched Dante process this. She watched him run it backward. 8 months, Calumet. What she would have had access to, what she would have been able to verify, what she would have been able to transmit. She watched him run it and then run it again because the first pass hadn't produced a result he was willing to accept. "Elena." He said her name in a very specific way, like a door being pressed against its frame. "Yes," she said. "You've been feeding your father information, yes." "For 8 months. Longer than that," she said. 8 months was when I found Calumet specifically. I've been paying attention for most of the last 3 years. He looked at her. She held the look. She had learned, through 3 years of practice, through countless moments that had required exactly this, how to hold a look with Dante without it becoming a contest she was trying to win. That was the mistake most people made. They tried to win. You didn't win a staring contest with a man who had spent his entire adult life establishing dominance through proximity and eye contact. What you did was simply not participate in the contest. You looked back, present and unafraid, and completely removed from the emotional architecture of his challenge. "You've been spying on me," he said. I've been documenting, she said. There's a difference. In your mind, maybe. In a courtroom, she said. There's a difference in a courtroom, which is where this is going if you don't hear my father out. Victor had been watching this exchange with the stillness of someone who understood that it needed to run its course. He closed the folder. He folded his hands on top of it. Sit down, Dante, he said. I'm not… Sit down! Same register, same unhurried quality, just firmer. The kind of firm that doesn't come from volume, but from the absolute certainty of the person delivering it. Dante sat. Victor looked at him. You're a careful man, he said. In most things. In business, you're meticulous. In people management, you're thorough. Where you've made your mistake is in consistently underestimating the people closest to you, particularly the ones you've chosen to be closest to. He paused. My daughter is not a woman who can be underestimated. I know that. You should have learned it. She's been running a covert operation inside my… She's been surviving, Victor said, inside a situation that required intelligence and careful management to navigate safely. The work she did was a byproduct of that survival. He glanced at Elena, brief, acknowledging. Though I won't pretend the documentation wasn't useful. What do you want? Dante said. Victor reopened the folder. He removed a sheaf of documents, perhaps 40 pages, and set them on the table between them. There are 3 things I want, he said. The first is Elena's immediate removal from your household. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight she returns home with a security detail that you will not know the composition of, and she will remain under that detail's protection until the legal processes I've initiated are complete. He pushed the document slightly forward. The second is that you release Marco Battiste's access to the secondary accounts he doesn't know you've been skimming from, because Marcus is the one who's going to need to testify to the structure of your operation, and you don't want him motivated by personal grievance on top of legal exposure. Dante's jaw had gone rigid. Marco is 61 years old, Dante. He has a daughter in Philadelphia and 2 grandchildren who don't know what their grandfather does. When I spoke with him 6 weeks ago, he was quite clear about what he was willing to do to make sure that remained the case. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a structural reality reorganizing itself. Elena watched her husband's face while this happened. She had thought sometimes about what this moment would look like, had constructed various versions of it in the hours between 3 and 5 in the morning when she lay awake beside him, running contingencies. In none of the versions she had constructed did she feel what she actually felt, which was something close to sorrow. Not for him. For the version of the situation that had been true once, briefly, before she understood what she was in. You said 3 things, Dante said. The third, Victor said, is that you walk away. Not just from Elena. From the political connections, the foundation access, the quiet arrangements you've built over the last 4 years using this city as a platform. You reduce your operation to what's legally defensible, you maintain that reduced operation, and you leave my daughter's name entirely alone. He looked at Dante over the table. In exchange, the documents Elena has compiled go into a secure location and remain there. The federal contacts I've made remain contacts and nothing more. You keep a version of your life. Dante was quiet. I want to be clear, Victor said, about what happens if you choose otherwise. I've spent 5 years building a legal operation whose specific capacity is the financial dismantling of the kind of empire you've constructed. Not law enforcement. I have no particular interest in a criminal process. What I have is the capacity to make your financial infrastructure functionally inoperable within 30 days. He paused. Elena's documentation accelerates that significantly. Marco's cooperation accelerates it further. You would be within 6 weeks in a position where the only thing you have left to bargain with is information about other people, which is not a position that tends to end well for the person in it. Dante had not moved for 2 minutes. Elena had watched him sit with this, had watched him run the calculations, test the assertions, look for the exits. She knew the shape of his processing. She had watched it hundreds of times. I was a man who had never in his adult life been cornered without a door, and the way he sat now, perfectly still, perfectly contained, told her that he was looking for the door and not finding one. You built all this, he said. Not to her father, to her. Yes, she said, while you were… He stopped. While you were in my house. While I was living inside a situation that required management, she said, which is what my father said. You were gathering evidence against me. I was making sure that when I left, you couldn't stop me. Another silence. The cheese board sat between them on the cart, irrelevant, faintly absurd. You were going to leave, he said. I have been going to leave for 3 years, she said. The question was always how to do it without disappearing. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in that look that she didn't have language for. Not remorse, not quite, but something adjacent to remorse that existed in the territory between what a person knows about themselves and what they're willing to name. She had seen that look before, in the first year, before she'd understood what she was dealing with. In the first year, she had thought that look meant he was capable of change. Later, she understood it meant he was capable of recognizing what he was, briefly, in moments when he couldn't manage the recognition away, and then proceeding as he always had. Think carefully, Victor said to Dante, about what you decide tonight. Dante stood. He straightened his jacket, the same automatic gesture he'd made in the ballroom. Then he walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the door frame. Tell Marco, he said, to no one in particular, that he's fired. Then he left. Victor watched the door close. Then he looked at Elena. They sat across from each other in the quiet of the room, and Elena felt the full weight of the evening land on her, in a way it hadn't been able to land while she was managing it, felt the throb in her jaw, and the tiredness, and the specific quality of relief that comes not from the end of a thing, but from the beginning of the end. Are you all right? Victor said. Not yet, she said. He nodded. He understood the distinction. He had always understood the distinction. He's not going to take the deal, she said. Victor looked at the folder. No, he said. He's not. He said it without urgency, without alarm. The way you say something that you have already accounted for in your planning, which means we go to the second stage. How long? We have everything we need, he said. Timing is the only variable. He paused. There are people inside his organization that you may not know about. People who have been reporting to me directly, not through you. She looked at him. How many? 4, he said. One of them has worked for him for 11 years. She absorbed this. You didn't tell me. I didn't want you managing that information inside his house, Victor said. The compartmentalization was protective. She understood it. She didn't entirely like it, but she understood it. Which 4? Victor smiled. Small, private, the smile he'd had since she was 12 years old, the one that meant you'll have the answer when you need it and not before. When you're home, he said. Tonight. She looked at the folder on the table, 40 pages of everything she had gathered. 14 months of Fenwick, 8 months of Calumet, 3 years of watching and recording and building, brick by brick. The foundation of the exit she'd always known she needed. Outside the door, somewhere in the building, Dante Moretti was making phone calls. She knew what the calls would be. She knew who he'd call first and second and third. She knew the names he'd use and the language he'd use and the instructions he'd give because she had spent 3 years learning the grammar of his crisis responses. Let him make the calls, she thought. Let him look for the door. She already knew where the door was, and she had made sure it only opened from her side. Dante made 4 calls before he reached the lobby. Elena knew this not because she was watching him. She wasn't. She was still in the hospitality suite with her father, listening to Victor outline the secondary protocols with the methodical patience of a man who had rehearsed this conversation many times, but because she knew the order in which Dante's mind worked under pressure. Crisis response for Dante followed a sequence as reliable as a reflex. First call was always to his driver, repositioning the car, because physical escape routes were how Dante's brain categorized safety. Second call was to the man who ran his security detail, a former federal agent named Bryce, who had been on Dante's payroll for 9 years, and who Elena had quietly assessed, 3 months ago, as the single most dangerous variable in the immediate aftermath of any confrontation. Third call was to one of the 2 city officials who had been sitting at their table, whichever one picked up first. Fourth call, always, was to the person whose name appeared nowhere in any of his contacts under their real name. She didn't know who that fourth call went to. That was the one gap in 8 months of careful attention, and it bothered her with the specific irritation of a puzzle that's missing a piece you know exists. Victor finished his outline. He stacked the documents back into the folder with the neatness of someone who understood that physical orderliness was a form of psychological control in chaotic circumstances. The security team will be at the west entrance in 12 minutes, he said. 1 vehicle, 2 men. You won't recognize them. Who are they? Former Interpol. I've worked with them for 4 years. He stood. They'll take you to the apartment on Gramercy, not the house. He'll have people at the house within the hour. Elena looked at the folder. I need the Calumet records, the physical copies, not the digital. They're already at Gramercy. And the Fenwick chain of custody documentation. Elena. Victor waited until she looked at him. Everything you need is there. You did your part. Let me do mine for the next 12 hours. She nodded. She understood, intellectually, that the appropriate response to the last 3 years of operating alone inside Dante's orbit was to accept help now that help was available and structurally sound. She understood it. The practice of it was harder. The practice of it required a rewiring of habits that had calcified over thousands of days of being the only person in a room she could trust. The people you mentioned, she said, the 4 inside his organization. Tomorrow. One of them, the one who's been with him 11 years. She stopped. She looked at the door. Is it Reyes? Victor was quiet for 2 seconds. That 2-second pause was, in his particular communication style, a confirmation. Carla Reyes, Elena said. Reyes managed Dante's legitimate real estate portfolio, had managed it since before Elena came into the picture. A compact, efficient woman of 50, who wore the same type of flat shoes every day, and who had, in 6 years, never once been warmer to Elena than professionally necessary. Elena had categorized her as loyally Dante's, had built her assessment of the organization's internal structure around that categorization. How long? She came to me, Victor said, about 2 years before you did. Elena absorbed this. 2 years before her, meaning Reyes had been feeding Victor information about Dante's operation while Elena was still in the early stages of understanding what she'd married. Meaning there had been an asset inside the organization that she hadn't known about, hadn't been able to factor in, had worked around without knowing she was working around it. You could have told me about her, Elena said. There were things I spent months verifying that she could have. If you had known about her, you would have changed your behavior around her, however slightly. Dante would have seen it. She wanted to argue this. She didn't argue it because he was right. What else don't I know, she said. Tomorrow, he said again. The security team was where Victor said they'd be. 2 men, west entrance, standing with the contained stillness of people who had learned to make themselves invisible in public spaces. Neither of them introduced themselves. One opened the vehicle door and the other positioned himself between Elena and the entrance until the door was closed and the vehicle was moving. A sequence that took 11 seconds and was executed with the kind of efficiency that made her understand why Victor had described them as former Interpol and not as a security firm with a good website. She sat in the back of the vehicle and watched Manhattan move past the windows and felt the bruise on her jaw with 2 fingers, not quite pressing, just mapping the territory of it. It had settled into a dull, radiating ache that ran from the point of impact up toward her cheekbone. By morning, it would be darker. She thought about that with the calm detachment of someone taking inventory of physical damage after the adrenaline has metabolized, not dramatizing it, not minimizing it, just noting it. Her phone showed 6 missed calls. 4 from Marco, 1 from a number she didn't recognize, 1 from a woman named Diane Cho, who was Elena's closest approximation to a friend in Manhattan, a corporate attorney who had been at the gala and who had very clearly seen what happened at the table. She called Diane back first. Diane picked up on the second ring. Tell me you're somewhere safe, Diane said. No preamble, no social lubrication. I'm in the car, Elena said. Are you hurt? I'll be fine. That's not what I asked. I know. Elena looked out the window. A couple was arguing on a corner. She couldn't hear them through the glass, could only see the body language, the forward lean and the stepped-back response. I'll be fine, Diane. I saw what he did. Diane's voice had the particular quality of controlled anger, the lawyerly containment of emotion that was still, clearly, emotion. In front of every major donor in that room, Elena. I have the names of at least 30 people who, don't do anything with that yet, I'm not going to do anything without your go-ahead. I just want you to know that there were witnesses, credible ones, people who will talk. I know. That's actually useful. Elena had already thought through the witness dimension, had in fact noted mentally when she walked away from the table that the two city officials and their wives represented four witnesses of significant social standing who were now legally exposed if they claimed not to have seen what they'd very clearly seen. Can you put together a preliminary list of who you know was in direct line of sight? Already started it in my head, Diane said. Email it to the Gramercy address. Not my regular one. A pause. How long have you been planning this? A while, Elena said. Another pause, longer. Is there anything you need tonight? Not tonight, Elena said. Tomorrow I'm going to need a family law attorney who handles high-conflict separations involving complex asset structures. Someone who's dealt with organized crime adjacency before. I have two names, Diane said without hesitation. I know you do, Elena said. That's why I called you first. She hung up. The car crossed into the Gramercy neighborhood and slowed. The apartment Victor kept there was in a pre-war building, not ostentatious, not the kind of address that would appear in any listing of Victor Vale's known properties. She had been there twice before, both times for meetings she hadn't told Dante about. The doorman recognized her and said nothing beyond a quiet greeting, which meant Victor had called ahead, which meant Victor had been managing more logistics tonight than she had been aware of. She went upstairs. The apartment was on the 8th floor, 2 bedrooms, furnished with the impersonal neatness of a space that was used for function rather than living. The physical files were where Victor had said they'd be. A locked document case on the kitchen table, key taped to the underside of the case in an envelope. She opened it and went through the files for 40 minutes, cross-referencing what she'd brought in her memory against what was in the physical record, checking for any gaps in the documentation chain that Dante's lawyers could exploit. There were 2. Small ones. She noted them. They were addressable. At 11:40, her phone rang. Marco. She had been expecting this. She let it ring 4 times, which was enough time to decide how she wanted to handle it, and then she answered. Where are you? Marco said. Somewhere you're not, she said. He exhaled. It was a particular kind of exhale, the kind that carries the weight of something that doesn't have a clean name. He knows about your father's people, Marco said. The ones inside the organization. He doesn't know which ones, but he knows the number. She went very still. How? The 4th call, Marco said. The one he makes when things go bad. The person he calls. I don't know who it is. Never have. But whoever it is, they gave him a number. 4 people. She sat with that. Someone in Victor's secondary network had a leak, or someone had been watching the watching, which was a level of counter-surveillance that she hadn't accounted for, and that Victor hadn't mentioned. Why are you calling me, Marco? The silence on his end was the silence of a man deciding how honest to be about something that had already moved past the point where dishonesty was useful. Because I was at that table, he said. And I watched what he did, and I've watched a lot of things over 22 years, Elena, and there's a line somewhere. He stopped. I just called to say, whatever you've built, build it fast, because he's not going to sit with this. I know. He's calling in debts tonight. People who owe him, political people, people with badges. He's going to try to get ahead of whatever your father has. How much time do I have? Before he does something irreversible? 48 hours, maybe less. Marco paused. I'm telling you this because you should know. Not because I'm not switching sides, Elena. I don't have sides anymore. I'm just an old man who watched something happen tonight that shouldn't have happened. I know, she said again. She meant it differently the second time. Marco hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, then called Victor. He picked up immediately, which meant he was still awake, which meant he was running his own logistics somewhere in the city. Marco just called me, she said. I know. He called me first. Someone in your secondary network has exposure. Dante has a number. Yes. Victor's voice was careful. I'm addressing that. Who's the leak? Not a leak, he said. He has someone watching the building where we've been meeting. Has had them there for 3 weeks. We've been managing around it. A pause. I should have told you. Yes, she said. You should have. Another pause. You're right. Victor Vale saying you're right had a specific weight to it. He did not say it often, and he did not say it as performance. Tomorrow, I'll give you everything. Full picture. 48 hours, she said. That's what Marco says. Marco is probably right, Victor said. Get some sleep if you can. I need you sharp tomorrow. She almost laughed. Not from humor, from the particular absurdity of the instruction given the circumstances. Good night, she said. She didn't sleep for a long time. She lay in the spare room of the Gramercy apartment and stared at the ceiling and let the events of the evening organize themselves in her mind the way evidence organizes itself when you give it space and quiet. The slap, the folder, Marco's call, the leak in the secondary network. The fourth call she still couldn't account for. She thought about Carla Reyes, thought about 50-year-old Carla in her flat shoes managing Dante's real estate portfolio for 11 years while simultaneously feeding information to Victor Vale, navigating that dual existence with the kind of discipline that Elena, who had done her own version of the same thing, could measure precisely. She thought about what it cost, that kind of discipline, what it took from you. She pressed her fingers against her jaw. The bruise had fully settled in, she thought, 48 hours. Then she stopped thinking and lay in the dark and listened to the city outside the window until something that was not quite sleep arrived sometime around 3 in the morning and took her briefly under. Dante's morning began at 5:45. He had not slept either. He had spent the night in the library of the house in Brooklyn Heights. Not the Manhattan apartment, the house. The one with the private entrance and the room in the basement that didn't appear on any floor plan. Sitting in the leather chair behind the desk that had been his father's desk, and making the kind of calls that happen in the hours when the people you're calling have been woken up and understand from the hour alone that the call is serious. By 6 in the morning, he had made 11 calls. By 7, he had 3 responses that mattered. The first was from a federal contact, not a direct feed, nothing so clean, but a man 3 steps removed from a particular office who confirmed that there had been no formal filing associated with Victor Vale in the preceding 72 hours, which meant whatever Victor was building was still in the assembly phase, which gave Dante a window. The second response was from his own attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who was 65 years old and who had been keeping Dante's legal exposure manageable for 16 years, and who had, in those 16 years, developed the specific communication style of a man who had learned to deliver bad news in the flattest possible language. Gerald told him that the documentation described by Victor Vale, if it existed and was what Victor claimed, represented a serious problem. Gerald told him that the Fenwick routing, specifically, had 3 points that were legally indefensible if someone with the right resources chose to pursue them. Gerald told him that the words legal operation applied to Victor Vale's described capacity were not words to dismiss. What do I do? Dante said. Tonight? Nothing, Gerald said. Give me 48 hours to understand the landscape. The third response was from the man Dante called on the fourth call, the number that didn't appear in his contacts, the number he dialed from memory, the one nobody around him knew existed. This man, whose name was not something Dante used over any phone, said 3 words and then hung up. She has Reyes. Dante sat in his father's chair and stared at the wall across from him, and thought about Carla Reyes, who had managed his real estate portfolio for 11 years, who had known, in that 11 years, things that nobody else had known, who had been, he had believed, the most reliable person in his organization, reliable in the specific sense of utterly without an independent agenda, utterly oriented by gratitude and self-interest toward maintaining her position. He had been wrong. He pulled on his jacket. He told his driver to have the car ready. Then he called Paulie Fenn, who ran his physical operations, and told him to pick up Carla Reyes. Paulie called back in 40 minutes. She's not at her apartment, Paulie said. Neighbor says she left last night. Luggage. Dante said nothing for 3 seconds. Find her. We're on it. Not find her by tomorrow. Find her today. He hung up. He sat in the car as it moved through morning Brooklyn, watching the streets he had grown up in, and then grown to own and then grown past, and he thought about the geometry of his current situation with the particular cold clarity that arrived in him. Sometimes, when everything had gone sufficiently wrong that sentimentality became a luxury he couldn't afford, he had been outmaneuvered, not beaten. He didn't accept beaten, didn't have a place in his mind where that word landed without being immediately rejected, but outmaneuvered, which was a different thing. Outmaneuvering implied a gap in information, implied that somewhere someone had seen more of the board than he had. He thought about Elena, thought about 6 years of Elena in his house, at his table, in his bed, thought about the face she made when he asked about the organization, the precise controlled neutrality he had always read as passivity, but that he was now, in the light of the last 12 hours, reading differently. The neutrality hadn't been passivity. The neutrality had been discipline. He had dismissed her. That was the specific failure, reduced to its cleanest form. He had looked at a woman who had grown up in a family with more operational sophistication than most of his captains possessed, and had seen someone who needed management. He had been so convinced by the narrative of her dependence, the father in exile, the diminished family resources, the social exposure that came with being attached to his name, that he had never seriously audited the actual evidence. The car stopped outside a building in Red Hook that served, officially, as a property management office. Unofficially, it was where Dante held meetings that didn't require the formality of the Brooklyn Heights house. He went upstairs to the 3rd floor and found 3 of his captains already there. Sal Greco, who was 53 and ran the waterfront operations, Tommy Vitale, who was 44 and managed the political relationships, and a man called Brick, whose real name Dante had not used in so long he sometimes forgot it, who handled the things that didn't have names in polite conversation. They were all in the room when he came in. They all looked at him with the particular careful attentiveness of men who had heard things and were waiting to understand what those things meant for them. Dante sat. He put both hands flat on the table. "Tell me what you know," he said. Sal went first. Sal had heard through his own network that 2 of Dante's financial intermediaries had been contacted overnight by people running what appeared to be a structured inquiry into the Moretti organization's legitimate asset holdings. Not law enforcement, private, but thorough, and with access to documentation that shouldn't have been accessible. Tommy went next. Tommy had made 6 calls to his political contacts this morning. 4 of them had not returned the calls. The 5th had returned it and been evasive in a way Tommy had never experienced in 12 years of managing those relationships. The 6th, a state senator whose cooperation Dante had maintained through a combination of financial support and certain information about the senator's personal life, had called Tommy unprompted and said, with no ceremony, that he was stepping back from any association with the Moretti organization effective immediately, and that Tommy should not contact him again. Brick said nothing. Brick looked at Dante and waited. "Brick?" Dante said. "The woman," Brick said. "What about her?" "She's been running a documentation operation for close to 3 years," Brick said. "I've had her under periodic surveillance for the last 8 months." Dante went very still. "You've had her under surveillance?" "I thought you knew," Brick said. "Why would I know if you didn't tell me?" Brick's jaw worked slightly. "I reported it to Marco," he said. 6 months ago, twice." The room was completely quiet. Dante looked at the table. He thought about Marco. Marco, who had called Elena 4 times last night. Marco, who had sat across from him at the gala with the face of a man watching something he couldn't stop. Marco, who had worked beside him for 22 years and who had apparently received 2 reports of surveillance on Elena and had said nothing. "Where's Marco?" Dante said. "He called in this morning," Sal said carefully. "Said he needed a few days." "Get me Marco," Dante said. "We've been trying to reach him since—" "Get me Marco." He stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the Red Hook street and felt the thing inside his chest that was anger, but also, underneath the anger, something colder. Something that understood, in the way that survival instinct understands things before the conscious mind catches up, that the architecture of the situation had been compromised at multiple levels, and that the damage was not only Elena, not only Victor, not only Reyes, but extended into the organization itself, into the people he had trusted with the mechanisms of his operation. He turned back to the room. "I want to know every contact Elena made in the last 3 years," he said. "Every phone call, every meeting, every person she was in a room with that I didn't put her in a room with. Start from the beginning and build me a map." He looked at Brick. "And I want it by tonight." "Some of it we don't have," Brick said. "Then build what you have and show me the gaps." He buttoned his jacket. "And nobody moves on Victor Vale's people without my direct order. Nobody. Not even if they find Reyes. You find her. You call me. You wait." He looked around the room. "We clear?" 3 heads nodded. He left the building. In the car going back toward Brooklyn Heights, he called Gerald Fitch. I need to move faster than 48 hours, Dante said. Dante, I have exposure inside my own organization, multiple layers. Victor Vale has had assets in place longer than I've been aware of. He paused. What's the fastest way to collapse the legal exposure on the Fenwick routing? Gerald was quiet for a moment. There isn't a fast way. There's a less slow way, which is to restructure the holding documentation in a way that creates legal ambiguity around the do it. It'll cost, I know what it'll cost. Do it today. He hung up. He thought about Elena in whatever location Victor had moved her to. Thought about the file on the table in the hospitality suite, 40 pages, organized, thorough. Thought about 3 years of watching, building, documenting, while he'd sat at dinners with her and conducted his business and believed, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once been seriously challenged in his domestic life, that the person beside him was legible. He had not read her at all. That was the thing that sat in his chest like something with edges. Not the strategic failure, not the legal exposure, the simple, brutal fact that a woman had lived inside his life for 6 years and he had never once actually looked at her. His phone buzzed. A message from Polly. Found Riaz. She's in a building in Chelsea. Victor Vale is with her. Dante read it twice. He typed back. Don't move. Watch the building. Send me the address. Then he sat in the car with the morning light coming through the windows and made the decision that he had known, since the hospitality suite last night, he was probably going to make. Not because it was the right decision, he was past evaluating decisions by that standard, but because it was the only decision that felt, to him, like not losing. He was going to Victor's building, not with Brick, not with Sal. He was going to go, and he was going to look Victor Vale in the face, and he was going to make the kind of offer that men in Gerald's profession described as compelling a negotiated resolution, but that Dante described in simpler language. He told his driver the address. The building in Chelsea was 12 stories, glass and stone, the kind of anonymous modern construction that existed in every expensive neighborhood as a place where money conducted itself without drawing attention. There was a lobby attendant. There were cameras in the lobby. 4 of them, Dante counted from the car. There were, he was certain, other cameras he couldn't see. He went in anyway. Polly met him in the lobby. Vale's on the 9th floor, Polly said. The woman, Reyes. She's up there with him. There are 2 other people. Men. Security. How long have they been there? Reyes arrived about an hour ago. Vale's been here since before we got here. Dante looked at the elevator. He thought about Gerald's voice saying there isn't a fast way. He thought about Tommy's contacts not returning calls. He thought about Marco saying, I need a few days, which was the language of a man who had already made a decision and was giving himself distance from the moment of its consequence. He pressed the elevator button. The ride to the 9th floor took 20 seconds. The hallway was quiet, carpeted, dim, the kind of building where you couldn't hear what was happening in the units on either side of you. He found the door he was looking for and knocked. It took long enough that he knew someone was looking at him through the camera above the door. Then it opened. Victor Vale stood in the doorway. He was dressed, despite the hour, with the same composed neatness as the night before. He looked at Dante without surprise. He looked at him the way you look at something you've run projections on. I thought you might come, Victor said. Then you know why I'm here. I know why you think you're here, Victor said. He stepped back. Come in. Dante stepped through the door and found himself in a long, clean-lined living space. Carla Reyes was at the table near the far windows. She looked at him when he entered and then looked away, with the composure of someone who had already done the most difficult thing they were going to do and was past the fear of it. The 2 security men stood near the kitchen, positioning that was casual in appearance and precise in function. And at the other end of the room, sitting in a chair with a coffee cup in her hands, wearing the same clothes from the night before, was Elena. She had not expected him to come here. He could see it, the micro-shift, the recalibration. She had expected the calls, the counter-moves, the chess of it. She had not expected him to walk through the door and stand 10 feet from her. He looked at her jaw. The bruise was darker in the morning light. You need to hear what I have to say, Dante said. He said it to the room, but he was looking at her. Victor closed the door behind him. We're listening, Victor said. Dante reached into his jacket. He produced a folded document. 2 pages, dense, his handwriting on the margins. He set it on the table in front of Victor. "That's the Fenwick account," he said. "The full chain, every routing point, every intermediary. I'm giving it to you." Victor looked at the document. He didn't touch it. "Why?" "Because I need you to understand something," Dante said. He looked at Elena. "Whatever you've built, whatever case you have, you're going to find that taking it apart legally is going to take longer than your father has told you. Gerald Fitch has been restructuring since 6 this morning. By tonight, the exposure on Fenwick will have changed enough that the documentation you have becomes Dante." Elena set down her coffee cup. Her voice was even. "Stop." He stopped. "You drove here," she said, "to tell me that you're making it harder." She looked at him. "That's what you came to say." "I came because there's still a way to resolve this that doesn't require—" "There isn't," she said. "That's what you haven't understood yet." She stood. She was not tall, but she was standing, and he was standing, and the 10 feet between them had a specific quality, not of distance, but of clarity, the way things look clear at the right distance that become blurred when you get too close. "There is no version of a resolution that has you in it," she said. "That's not me being vindictive. That's just what it is." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those gray eyes that he had misread for 6 years, and that he was reading correctly, finally, now. "I want—" He stopped. He had been going to say, "I want you to come home," which was so divorced from the reality of the situation that even he could hear it before he said it. "I want to know when it changed," he said instead. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at him for a long moment. "It didn't change," she said finally. "You just started being more honest about what you were." He picked up the document from the table. He put it back in his jacket. He looked at Victor. "You think you've won this," he said. "I think you've lost it," Victor said. "Those aren't the same thing." Dante walked back to the door. He opened it. He turned back once. He didn't know why. Some old reflex, some version of himself from 20 years ago that still believed rooms could be left differently than they were entered. Elena had already turned away. He left the building. He sat in the car and told his driver to take him back to Brooklyn Heights. He called Paulie and told him to stand down. He called Gerald and told him to accelerate the restructuring. He called Brick and told him he wanted the organizational map by 6, not tonight. Then he sat in the back of the car with his hands in his lap and made the decision that he had been avoiding since 5:45 that morning, the decision that he had known was underneath everything else, the one that could not be walked back from once it was made. He called a man in the Bronx, a man whose service he had not used in 4 years and whose rate had tripled in that time, and whom he had told himself he would not use again. "I have a situation," Dante said. "Who?" the man said. Dante told him about Reyes. The man was quiet for a moment. "1 or 2? "1, Dante said. "Make it look like she left voluntarily." He hung up. He pressed his knuckles flat against the seat beside him and felt the full weight of what he had just done land on him, and then felt himself absorb it, the way he had absorbed every irreversible thing in 30 years, by making it part of what he was, rather than something that happened to him. By the time the car reached Brooklyn Heights, the morning had fully arrived. The call to the man in the Bronx took 40 seconds. Carla Reyes was dead before noon. Elena didn't know this yet when she left the Chelsea building at 10:15 with Victor's security detail flanking her on both sides and the morning cold working its way through the coat she'd borrowed from the apartment closet. She didn't know it when she sat in the back of the car reviewing the organizational map she'd built over 30 months, the hand-drawn version, pencil on legal paper, the one she kept in the document case because she didn't trust digital storage for anything she'd constructed herself. She didn't know it when she arrived at the Gramercy apartment and made coffee and spread the Fenwick documentation across the kitchen table and began the work of identifying which of Gerald Fitch's restructuring moves were most likely, given what she knew about how Fitch operated under pressure. She found out at 12:40 when Victor called. He said it the way he said difficult things, directly, without softening, in the tone of someone who understood that softening difficult information was a form of disrespect to the person receiving it. "Reyes is gone," he said. Elena stopped. She was standing at the kitchen counter with a pen in her hand. Gone how? Her body was found in a parking structure in Midtown. 40 minutes ago. It's being processed as an accident. She fell from the third level. A pause. She did not fall. Elena set the pen down. She placed both hands flat on the counter and looked at the wall in front of her. Carla Reyes in her flat shoes. Carla Reyes, who had been feeding Victor information for 2 years before Elena found her own way to the same conclusion. Carla Reyes, who had sat across the Chelsea apartment this morning and looked at Dante when he walked in with the composure of someone who has already moved past fear into something more permanent. "He did this from the car," Elena said, "on the way back to Brooklyn. That's our assessment. She was in a building with your security team." "She left," Victor said, "about 40 minutes after Dante did. She said she needed to get something from her apartment. I should have had someone with her." The should have from Victor carried a specific weight that it wouldn't have carried from anyone else. Victor Vale did not use that phrase lightly. I used it when the failure was real and the consequence was irreversible and the accounting had to be done cleanly. "What does this do to the case?" Elena said. "Reyes was corroborating, not foundational. The core documentation doesn't change." He paused. "But she was also a person, and she's dead because she helped us." Elena heard this. She stood with it. The counter was cold under her palms. "He's escalating," she said. "Yes. He's not going to take the deal. He was never going to take the deal. I think we both knew that. But now he's moved past containment strategy into something else." "Yes," Victor said again. "He's scared," she said. And then, correcting herself, No, he's cornered. He's doing what cornered men do when they've built their entire identity around never being cornered." "Elena," Victor's voice shifted slightly. "The 48-hour window has changed. We need to move faster now." "How fast?" "I've contacted the federal office. Not filed, not yet, but the conversation has started. They want the Fenwick chain and the Calumet documentation as a package, together with the routing verification. I need you to compile the final package today." "I can have it by 6. "By 4, he said. "Please." She pulled the pen back toward her. She uncapped it. She looked at the documentation spread across the table and thought about Carla Reyes in a parking structure in Midtown, and felt the specific quality of anger that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation, the anger of having your worst assessment of someone proven accurate at the highest possible cost. "I'll have it by 3, she said. She worked. She worked the way she had learned to work inside Dante's house, with full concentration, without the luxury of emotional processing interfering with the mechanical requirements of the task, moving through the documents with the systematic attention of someone who understood that the difference between a case that held and a case that collapsed was almost always in the connective tissue between pieces of evidence rather than in the pieces themselves. She compiled. She cross-referenced. She filled the 2 gaps she'd identified the night before with documentation she found in the secondary files Victor had included in the case. Things she hadn't known existed until she opened the folders, things that told her, once again, that Victor's operation had been running at a depth she had not fully mapped. At 2:15, her phone showed a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered because the prefix was a Brooklyn exchange, and because her brain, trained by 3 years of learning to flag anomalies, flagged it. "Elena Moretti," the voice said. "Male." She didn't recognize it. "This is someone who is trying to help you, so please stay on the line." "Who is this?" "My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I work for Gerald Fitch, and I've been in Fitch's office this morning, and I've heard things that you need to know." She moved to the window. She looked down at the street below. The 2 security men were still at the building entrance. She could see the top of one of their heads. "I'm listening," she said. "Fitch has been in contact with a man named Paulie Fenn since 7 this morning. They've been coordinating on something that isn't the Fenwick restructuring." The voice was controlled but slightly too fast. The cadence of someone who had made a decision to do something and was now executing it before they could change their mind. "There's a woman named Diane Cho. She's your attorney contact?" Elena's hand tightened on the phone. "What about her?" "Fitch has her office under surveillance. Not legal surveillance. Physical. There's a man in the building across from her office who's been there since 8 this morning." A pause. "That's not the part you need to know. The part you need to know is that Fitch made a call to someone inside the federal office about an hour ago. Someone inside the specific office your father has been in contact with." Elena went very still. "He has a source," the voice said. Inside the federal contact your father has been talking to. The conversation this morning about filing the Fenwick package. Fitch knows about it. He knew about it within 20 minutes of it happening. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. She opened them. Outside, a truck was backing into a loading bay across the street, its reverse alarm punctuating the silence on her end of the call with a mechanical beeping that seemed, in this moment, completely absurd. How long has Fitch had this source? I don't know how long, but I know it's not new. Why are you telling me this? A pause, longer than the others. Because I've worked for Gerald Fitch for 6 years, and I know what Reyes's death means. And I know that whoever is next on the list of people who can hurt Dante Moretti is in a specific kind of danger, and your name is on that list. Another pause. I have a daughter, he said. Just that. No elaboration. Elena understood. She didn't thank him. There wasn't a way to thank someone for that kind of information in a way that matched its weight. Is there anything else? She said. That's everything I have. He hung up. She stood at the window for 10 seconds. Then she called Victor. He answered on the first ring. She said, "Stop the federal contact right now. Don't make another call to that office. Don't send anything. Don't follow up." She said it quickly and without preface because there wasn't time for preface. Fitch has a source inside. He knew about this morning's conversation within 20 minutes. The silence on Victor's end had a specific texture to it, not shock. Victor Vale did not do shock, or if he did, he processed it somewhere internal and invisible. What she heard was the quality of a man revising his entire operational picture in real time. You're certain? Certain enough. Where did this come from? Someone in Fitch's office. I don't know the name, didn't ask. The information is specific enough and accurate enough about this morning's timeline that I believe it. If Fitch has known about the federal contact, Victor stopped. He started again. If Fitch has had that source for any significant amount of time, then Dante knows the structure of our approach. He knows we were going to file the package. He's been building countermoves around that knowledge. Yes, Elena said. That's what I'm thinking. The restructuring this morning wasn't just about Fenwick, Victor said, more to himself than to her. If he knew we were filing a package, the restructuring was about creating enough legal ambiguity to make the package file as inconclusive. Yes, she had already worked through this while she was dialing. Which means the Fenwick chain we have, the one I've been compiling, may not be as clean as I thought it was, because he's been restructuring specifically around what he knew we were going to submit. Another silence. This one had a different quality. The silence of two people who have had a plan for a significant amount of time, recognizing simultaneously that the plan has been compromised at a foundational level. How much of the package does this affect? Victor said. I don't know yet. I need to look at what Fitch would have known and when, and compare it against the restructuring timeline. She moved to the table. She sat down. She looked at the documents in front of her, the compiled package she had been planning to have ready by 3 o'clock. Give me an hour. Elena, 1 hour, then call me. She worked through the documents differently this time, not compiling, auditing, asking a different question. If Gerald Fitch had known the shape of this package for weeks or months, what would a systematic restructuring look like, and how far had it gotten, and which parts of the documentation chain were now running into restructured territory rather than the original structure they had been built to prove? It took 50 minutes. What she found was not a collapsed case. What she found was a case with a specific architectural problem, 3 points in the Fenwick chain where the restructuring Fitch had started that morning, if completed, would introduce enough legal ambiguity that a competent defense attorney could argue multiple interpretations. The chain still held, but it held in the way a bridge holds when two of its supports have been partially undermined, technically intact, functionally unreliable, and vulnerable to specific pressure at specific points. She called Victor. The case holds, she said when he answered. But it needs work. Specific work on 3 points in the Fenwick chain. She had the documents in front of her, annotated now, the 2 gaps from the night before joined by 3 new notations in red pen. And we need a different approach to filing, not through the federal contact. Who else do we have? Diane, she said. Diane Cho is a family law attorney, Elena. She has 2 names for high-conflict organized crime adjacency cases. She told me last night, I need to know who they are. She paused. Fitch's man is watching her building, which means Dante thinks she's a link in the chain, which means she might also be in a category of risk that Reyes was in. The silence on Victor's end was very short. I'll call her. I'll call her. She'll take it better from me. Elena picked up her pen. And I need you to tell me everything you know about the federal source, not the contact, the source inside the contact. If Fitch has had someone in place, there's a record of it somewhere. There's always a record. I'll make calls, Victor said. Victor? She stopped. She looked at the red annotations on the documents. Reyes, did she know there was risk in coming to you when she first came? Did she understand what she was getting into? Victor was quiet for a moment. She understood, he said. She was not naive about it. Did she know it could go this far? I think, Victor said carefully, that she understood it could and made a decision that she was willing to carry that, same as you. He paused. Same as me. Elena looked at the wall. She thought about willing and unwilling, about the decisions that look like choices when you make them and reveal themselves as something more like inevitabilities, in retrospect. She thought about Carla Reyes deciding to carry it, carrying it for 2 years, and then the carrying ending in a parking structure in Midtown. 3 o'clock, she said. Call me with whatever you have on the federal source. She called Diane. Diane picked up on the first ring. Her voice had the quality of someone who had been waiting for a call and had been spending the waiting time preparing themselves. I was going to call you, Diane said. There's a man in the building across from my office. He's been there since this morning. I know, Elena said. Listen to me carefully. I need the 2 names you mentioned last night, the attorneys. Okay, I can give you those. And I need you to leave your office, not go home somewhere else. Do you have somewhere you can go that isn't your home and isn't your office and that isn't associated with me? A pause. My sister's place, in Hoboken. Go there. Now. Don't take your regular route. Take something indirect. Cab, not car service. Pay cash. Leave your work phone in your desk and take a personal phone only. Elena. Diane's voice was steady, but the steadiness had a worked quality to it. What happened to Carla Reyes wasn't an accident. It wasn't a question. No, Elena said. Am I in that category? I don't know. I'm not going to tell you you're not when I don't know for certain. What I know is that moving you out of a location he has under surveillance is the right thing to do regardless. Okay, Diane said. 3 seconds passed. Okay. The 2 names, Peter Halverson and Maria Connolly. Both in Manhattan, both have dealt with RICO-adjacent proceedings. Halverson is better for asset protection. Connolly is better if it goes fully criminal. Thank you. Are you safe? I have 2 people with me, Elena said. Go to your sister's. She hung up. She looked at the time, 2:58. She had been working for nearly 3 hours without eating anything, and the coffee from this morning had metabolized into a low headache that she registered and set aside. She called Peter Halverson's office, got a paralegal, explained in precise terms that communicated urgency without hysteria that she was Elena Vale, using her maiden name deliberately, and that she needed a consultation with Halverson today regarding a high-conflict separation with significant organized crime asset adjacency. The paralegal put her on hold, came back in 4 minutes. Halverson could see her at 5. She set the phone down. She looked at the compiled documents, the annotated, imperfect, compromised but holding case she had spent 30 months building. She thought about what Fitch's source inside the federal contact meant, ran it backward, tried to identify when the leak had started. The federal contact had been established by Victor 8 months ago. If Fitch had been in place from the beginning, then Dante had known the general shape of the opposition's strategy for 8 months, had known and had been managing around it, restructuring, repositioning, while maintaining the surface presentation of someone who was caught off guard. She thought, he knew, not everything, but the architecture of it. He knew, and he sat across from her at dinners and looked at her and knew. She picked up her pen. She started a new page. She wrote the question at the top. What does he know that I don't know he knows? And underneath it, she began the list. She was on the 4th item of the list when the security team's radio went active. She heard it from the kitchen, the sharp static burst of a channel opening, then a voice, then the sound of one of the men moving quickly toward the building entrance. She was at the apartment door before she'd consciously decided to move. The security man near the entrance, the shorter of the two, the one who had driven, was on his radio. When he saw her in the hallway, he put one hand up. "Stay back." She didn't go back. She waited. "What's happening?" she said. "Vehicle outside. It's been sitting for 20 minutes. We're running the plate." She leaned to see around him through the lobby window. A black car, idling, double parked. Standard enough to be invisible. Positioned at the specific angle that gave its occupants a full view of the building entrance. "The plate," she said. "What does it come back to?" The radio crackled. The other man's voice came through. "Registered to a property management company in Red Hook. Company name is..." She didn't need to hear the rest. Red Hook. Dante's operational building. The place he held meetings that required no formality. "We need to leave," she said. "We're assessing..." "We need to leave now," she said. "Through the rear entrance if there is one. If not, we move through the building's service exit." She picked up the document case from inside the apartment door. She'd brought it to the hallway when she heard the radio. Instinct. The same instinct that had made her pick up her clutch from the gala table before she walked away. "Call my father. Tell him the Gramercy location is compromised." The security man looked at her for 1 second. Then he made the call. They went through the service exit, a narrow stairwell that smelled of old paint, descending 3 flights to an exit that opened onto the building's rear alley. Elena came through the door into the cold with the document case against her chest, and the second security man a step ahead of her and the first a step behind. And she stood in the alley for 2 seconds, breathing the cold air and feeling the full weight of the morning. Reyes, the federal source, the compromised package, the black car outside, land on her at once. She had been operating since last night with the assumption that the foundation she and Victor had built was solid enough to withstand Dante's pressure, that the evidence was clean enough, the timing was manageable. The structural advantage of having documentation and allies inside his organization was sufficient to make the outcome, if not certain, at least probable. That assumption was now gone. She had documentation that was legally vulnerable at 3 points. She had a federal approach that was compromised before it started. She had one asset inside his organization who was dead, and 2 others whose status she didn't know. She had a location that had just been made. What she had left was the case itself, whatever remained of it, and Peter Halverson at 5 o'clock, and 30 months of knowing exactly how Dante Moretti thought. A car came around the corner of the alley. She tensed. The security man in front stepped sideways, hand moving toward his jacket. And then the car slowed and the window came down, and it was Victor. He looked older than he had that morning. Not dramatically. Victor Vale didn't do dramatic aging, but something in the set of his face had shifted since the Chelsea building. Some quality of certainty replaced by something that cost more to maintain. He looked at Elena. He looked at the document case. "Get in," he said. She got in. The 2 security men got into a second vehicle that materialized from the far end of the alley. Victor had coordinated this without telling her, which was either operational efficiency or the beginning of a communication pattern she was going to have to address. She thought the former. She thought there would be time for the latter. The car moved. Victor didn't speak immediately. He looked out the window and Elena looked at the document case on her lap, and the city moved past them on both sides. "The federal source," Victor said, finally. "I have a name." She looked at him. "His name is Dennis Carver. He's a paralegal in the office of the assistant U.S. attorney who I've been speaking with." Victor's voice was entirely flat, the flatness of someone delivering information they find personally embarrassing. "He's been on Fitch's payroll for approximately 14 months. 14 months, Elena said, "since before you established the federal contact." "Yes." "How is that possible?" Carver was apparently monitoring several parallel inquiries into organized crime-adjacent financial activity in the city. When my contact established itself as connected to a Vale financial operation, Carver flagged it for Fitch. Victor paused. "It was proactive surveillance rather than targeted placement. He wasn't put there for us specifically. We walked into it." Elena absorbed this. "Does the AUSA know?" "Not yet. I'm debating the sequence of that disclosure." "Tell them today," Elena said. "Before Fitch finds out, we know. If the AUSA finds out through us first, we control the framing of how the compromise happened. If they find out through Fitch's maneuvering, we look like we were hiding it." Victor nodded slowly. Yes. And tell them about Reyes, she said. The full account of what happened this morning, the Chelsea meeting, Dante coming to the building, Reyes leaving, the timeline. She looked at the document case. A woman is dead, Victor. That's not documentation. That's a material witness who was killed within 2 hours of Dante leaving a building where she was present. That's something a federal office cares about, independent of our financial case. You want to reframe the approach, Victor said, from financial documentation to a pattern of conduct that includes obstruction and witness intimidation with lethal results. She paused. Yes, that's what I want. Victor looked at her. There was something in the way he looked at her, something she had seen occasionally, across her life, in moments when she had said something that he had been reaching toward but hadn't gotten to. The attorneys, he said. Halverson. 5 o'clock, she said. I need you there. I'll be there. The car continued moving. They were heading uptown, she realized, not toward any specific address she recognized, which meant Victor was keeping them in motion deliberately. She understood this. A moving vehicle was harder to surveil than a stationary location. She opened the document case. She looked at the annotated Fenwick chain. 3 red marks, 3 vulnerable points. She thought about what a reframe meant for those points. Whether the financial chain needed to be airtight, if the broader pattern of conduct established something, the financial chain was only one element of. Halverson would know. Halverson would have seen the architecture of this kind of case before. That was what the 5 o'clock meeting was for. Her phone rang. Unknown number, different exchange from the Fitch paralegal. She looked at it. She answered. Mrs. Moretti. A voice she recognized instantly, with the specific physical response of recognition that bypasses the conscious mind. Her body identified the voice before her brain finished processing it. Tommy Vitale. Dante's political relationship manager. This is Tommy. I need you to listen. Tommy. She kept her voice completely neutral. I don't have a lot of time. Dante knows you're moving today. Not your location, not specifically, but he knows the timeline has shifted and he's made a decision. Tommy's voice had the particular quality of a man talking at the edge of his own fear. Controlled, but the control visible as a layer over something else. He's taking the advisor. Elena's breath changed, one involuntary shift that she managed back to neutral in under a second. What advisor? The man your father uses for operational coordination. Older man. I don't know his name, but Dante has a name. Brick found him this afternoon. Tommy stopped. They're moving tonight. He wanted me to know because I don't know why he told me. Maybe because he wanted a witness. Maybe because he wanted me involved, and this was the warning. Another stop. I'm not going to be involved, but I needed someone to know, so... Where? Elena said. I don't know where they're taking him. Tommy, does Brick have him already, or are they moving tonight? Tonight, Tommy said. After dark, that's all I know. He hung up. Elena looked at Victor. Victor had heard enough. Her side of it, the responses, the shift in her face. He was already watching her with the focused attention of someone who knows a landscape has just changed and is waiting for the assessment. Your operational coordinator, she said. The man who handles the logistics for your secondary network. Older. Who is he? Victor went very still. His name is Bernard, he said. Bernard Chu. He lives in Queens. Dante has his name, Elena said. They're moving on him tonight. She watched Victor Vale, who had spent 40 years making decisions at the highest levels of financial and personal risk, who had navigated the exile and the rebuild, and the 20 years of working in the shadow of his own diminished name. She watched him absorb this, and she watched the thing that moved across his face, that was not quite fear, but was the version of fear available to people who have decided fear is not a useful category. We have to get Bernard out, he said. Yes, she said, and we have to do it before dark, which means we have approximately 4 hours. The security team, call Bernard, right now. Tell him to leave his house immediately. Don't go to a neighbor, don't call anyone, just leave and get to a specific location you designate. She was already thinking through it. The geometry of moving a person out of a known location before a team that knew the location could get there. It was a problem with the solution. The solution required speed, and it required Victor making the call in the next 3 minutes. Can you reach him directly? Yes. Then call him, now.
while we're in the car.
Victor already had his phone out. She watched him dial, watched him wait through the rings, watched his jaw set in the particular way it set when something didn't go the way it needed to go. The call went to voicemail. Victor left a message, short, precise, the kind of message that communicated urgency without context for anyone who might intercept it. Then he called another number, then a third. He was building a chain, she understood, trying to reach Bernard through adjacent contacts when the direct line didn't connect. Elena sat in the moving car and pressed her hands flat on the document case and felt the full shape of the situation as it now existed. The case she had built over 30 months, compromised and restructured. The federal approach, contaminated before it started. Reyes dead. The Gramercy location blown. Bernard Chu unreachable with Dante's people moving on him tonight. She had come into this believing the documentation was the weapon. She had spent 30 months constructing it as the primary instrument of what happened next. She had been right about that. She still believed she was right about that. But she had been wrong about the conditions under which it would operate. She had imagined a cleaner battlefield. She had imagined that Victor's preparation and her own evidence and the assets inside the organization would constitute a sufficient structural advantage. What she had instead was a fractured coalition, a compromised legal route, and a man who had just ordered the death of one person and was moving on a second, and who was doing all of this not from strength, but from the specific dangerous energy of a cornered animal that has decided the only move available is to destroy the walls of the cage. Victor's fourth call connected. She heard a voice on the other end. Victor said, "Bernard, listen to me. You need to leave your house right now." A pause. "Bernard," Victor said. His voice had changed. She looked at him. His face had changed. "Bernard, stay on the line with me. Tell me exactly where you are in the house." She understood from his face before he said anything else. She understood it the way you understand the conclusion of a sentence before it's finished, when you know the grammar of the situation well enough to predict the ending. "He's already there," Victor said, not into the phone. Into the car, to Elena. "Dante's people. They're already at the house." The phone was still at Victor's ear. From across the seat she could hear Bernard's voice, low, controlled, the voice of a man speaking carefully because there were other people in the room who he did not want to know he was on the phone. She could not make out the words. She could make out the quality. She said, "Tell him to do whatever they say." Victor looked at her. "Tell him to cooperate," she said, "right now. Tell him he is not to resist and not to give them any reason to escalate." Her voice was completely flat. "If Bernard fights them, they'll hurt him. If he cooperates, he's a hostage. Hostages have value. Value keeps people alive." Victor relayed this into the phone. She watched him listening. She watched Bernard's response register on Victor's face, the particular expression of someone absorbing something they were not prepared to absorb, which on Victor looked like the removal of all expression rather than the addition of distress. "He says there are 3 of them," Victor said quietly. "He says they're not hurting him. They're telling him to get his coat." "That's good," Elena said. "That means they want him mobile. They want to move him somewhere, which means he's an asset, not a—" She stopped herself. "That means we have time." Victor spoke into the phone for another 30 seconds. Then the call ended. He sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the street outside the car window. "Where will they take him?" he said. "I don't know," Elena said. "But Dante is going to use him the same way he used Reyes, as a pressure point, as a message. Except this time, instead of destroying the asset, he's going to try to trade it." She looked at Victor. "He's going to call you, probably tonight, and he's going to tell you what he wants in exchange for Bernard." "And what does he want?" She looked at the document case on her lap. At 30 months of work, at the annotated Fenwick chain and the Calumet documentation and the routing verification that was supposed to be the instrument of everything that came next. "The package," she said. "He wants the documentation, all of it, and he wants us to walk away from the federal approach entirely." She paused. "He's not trying to win anymore, Victor. He's trying to make us lose." The car kept moving. Outside, Manhattan went about its afternoon. People on sidewalks, cabs, and delivery trucks. The ordinary mechanical noise of a city that contained, within its ordinary afternoon, a man being walked to a car in Queens with 3 people around him who had not identified themselves and did not need to, and a woman in a moving car with a document case on her lap, who was running the geometry of the situation and finding, for the first time in 30 months, that the geometry did not resolve into a clean answer. She thought about Bernard Chu's voice on the phone, low, controlled, not panicking. She thought about Carla Reyes deciding she was willing to carry the risk. She looked at Victor. "When he calls," she said, "don't negotiate. Don't agree to anything. Just listen and tell him you need time. And then?" "And then," Elena said, "I need to think about whether the version of this I've been building is still the right version." She looked at the document case. Because the battlefield has changed, and fighting the old battle on a new battlefield is how people lose things they can't afford to lose. Victor looked at her. He had the face of a man waiting for the rest of a thought. She opened the document case. She looked at the papers inside. 30 months of her life, reduced to annotated pages, red marks indicating points of vulnerability. "There's another way to do this," she said. "There's a version that doesn't require the federal approach at all." She looked up. "It's faster, it's more direct, and it requires me to do something I've been avoiding." "What?" Victor said. She looked at the city outside the window. She thought about the thing she'd been holding back. The piece of the operation she'd built and then not used, the specific piece that she'd decided was too aggressive, too exposed, too much of a departure from the careful documentation-first strategy she'd committed to. The piece that required her to step out of the position of the person building the case and into something else entirely. "It requires me to go to Dante directly," she said. Victor said nothing. "Not to negotiate," she said, "not to threaten, to show him something that changes what he thinks is possible." She turned to look at her father. "I need you to trust me on the specifics, because if I explain it and you try to manage it, it won't work." Victor Vale looked at his daughter for a long moment. He looked at her the way he had looked at her when she was 12, and had made a decision he hadn't anticipated, and he was deciding whether to override it or learn from it. "How long do you need?" he said. "Until tomorrow morning," she said. Outside the window, the afternoon light was already beginning to thin toward evening, and somewhere in Queens, Bernard Chu was getting into a car he had not chosen to get into, and somewhere in Brooklyn, Dante Moretti was waiting for a phone that hadn't rung yet, and Elena held the document case on her lap and felt the full weight of the decision she had just made settle into her chest like something that had been circling for a long time and had finally landed. Elena made one call before the car stopped moving. Not to Halverson, not to Diane. She called a number she had memorized 14 months ago and never used. A number that existed in her planning the way a fire exit exists in a building. Not because you expect to need it, but because the day you need it and don't have it is the day everything ends badly. The number rang twice. A woman answered. "Yes." "This is Elena Vale," she said. "I need the package delivered to the Brooklyn Heights address. Tonight. Before 9. A pause of exactly 3 seconds. "Confirmed." She hung up. Victor looked at her from across the seat. She did not explain the call. She had told him she needed him to trust her on the specifics, and she had meant it, and he understood. She could see him deciding to understand it, which was a different thing and harder, but he did it. The car stopped on a block in Murray Hill. Victor's driver cut the engine. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray and cold, the kind of late autumn cold that arrived in Manhattan without the courtesy of a gradual transition, just a shift in the quality of the air, sudden and total, like a door opening onto a different season. "There's something you need to know before tonight," Victor said. She looked at him. "The fourth call," he said. "The one Dante makes when things go wrong. I know who it goes to." She had been waiting for this. She had been waiting for it since Marco mentioned it 2 days ago, and she had not pushed Victor on it because she had been managing too many other variables, and she had understood in the back of her mind that Victor's withholding of this particular piece had a reason that was going to be complicated when it arrived. "Tell me," she said. "His name is Raymond Foss," Victor said. "He's a retired federal judge, 63 years old. He sat on the Second Circuit for 11 years before he retired in 2019. He paused. "He and I were at Columbia together. We have been, for the past 40 years, something that falls between acquaintance and friend." Another pause. "He has been, for the past 8 years, a private legal consultant. Among his clients, until approximately 18 months ago, was Dante Moretti." She processed this. "Until 18 months ago. They had a dispute," Victor said, "over a specific matter I won't detail right now. Foss walked away from the arrangement. Dante has been using him since as a pressure point is probably the right phrase. Foss knows things about the Moretti operation that Foss would prefer remained private. Dante has leverage over him. Yes. And Foss, when Dante calls him, what does he provide? Guidance, Victor said. Legal architecture. The way to structure certain moves so that they fall within defensible parameters. He looked at his hands. The Fenwick restructuring this morning, Gerald Fitch is competent, but the specific approach to creating legal ambiguity at those 3 points you identified was not Fitch's design. It was too elegant for Fitch. Elena looked at the street outside. A woman walked past with 2 small children, one on each hand, both in bright coats. The ordinary afternoon moving alongside the thing she was sitting inside of. You should have told me about Foss, she said. Yes, Victor said. I should have. Is he willing to talk to us? Victor was quiet for a moment. He might be. If the leverage Dante has over him were neutralized. Can it be? That's what I've been working on for 6 weeks, Victor said. The matter Dante has leverage on. It's a financial matter. A specific transaction from 2016 that Foss participated in as an advisor. If I can provide documentation showing that Foss's participation was within legal parameters, which it was, barely, but it was, then the leverage disappears. She looked at him. Do you have that documentation? I have most of it, he said. The final piece is in a filing in the Southern District Court records. It's public record. It just requires someone to know what they're looking for and where it is. Get it today, she said. Before 9 o'clock. I have someone already on it. She looked at the document case on her lap. She thought about Raymond Foss, retired federal judge, Columbia classmate of Victor's, the man on the other end of Dante's 4th call, the man who had designed the elegant ambiguity in the Fenwick restructuring. She thought about what a retired federal judge with full knowledge of the Moretti operation's legal architecture could provide if the leverage pinning him to Dante were removed. She thought, that's the piece I was missing. Tonight, she said, if your person gets the filing, can you have Foss at the Brooklyn Heights address by 9? Victor looked at her. The Brooklyn Heights address is Dante's house. Yes. You want Raymond Foss at Dante's house. I want Raymond Foss where Dante can see him, she said. I want Dante to watch the man he's been using as an architecture consultant walk through the door on our side of this. She picked up the document case. And I want to be the one who opens that door. Victor Vale sat with this for 10 seconds. She watched him work through it, the logistics, the risk profile, the probability of various outcomes given what they knew about Dante's current state of mind and resource deployment. He has people in that house, Victor said. Not many. He's deployed most of his physical resources externally, finding Reyes, taking Bernard, watching Diane's building, watching Gramercy. He's spread. She had been calculating this since the car started moving. His driver, possibly 1 or 2 additional people inside. Brick is managing the Bernard situation. She looked at Victor directly. I'm not going in as an adversary. I'm going in as his wife. That's still a category that opens the door. Elena, I need Bernard's safe first, she said. That's the sequence. Bernard's safe, Foss in place, then the house. She opened the document case and extracted 3 pages. The cleanest section of the Fenwick chain, the section that didn't touch the 3 compromise points, the section that stood on its own as a clear, legally coherent record of a specific set of financial decisions. She put them in a separate envelope she found in the case. This goes to Halverson tonight, regardless of what else happens. He needs to start building around it, even if the larger package needs restructuring. I'll take it to him. You won't be at the house? I'll be available, Victor said. I won't be inside. He looked at her. I'm not going to pretend I'm comfortable with this. I know, she said. Get me Bernard. Get me Foss. The rest is mine. She got out of the car. The 2 security men repositioned immediately, one ahead, one behind, the same 11-second sequence from the Gramercy building, recalibrated for a sidewalk. She walked half a block and stood at the corner and looked at the city around her and let herself have 30 seconds of pure physical awareness. The cold, the sounds, the particular smell of a Manhattan evening arriving, exhaust and food carts, and the distant bass of a truck on the avenue. The bruise on her jaw had stopped being a sharp pain and settled into a dull, persistent ache that she had stopped registering consciously, but that was still there, still present, a physical annotation of how the last 24 hours had moved. She pulled out her phone. She called Dante. He picked up on the second ring. He had been expecting a call, not necessarily from her, but a call, and when it turned out to be her, she could hear the micro-adjustment in his breathing, the shift from prepared to recalculating. "Elena," he said. "I know about Bernard," she said. "I know you have him, and I know why." He said nothing. "I'm coming to the house tonight," she said. 9 o'clock. I'm coming alone." She paused. "I'm not coming to negotiate. I'm coming to show you something that changes the picture for both of us. If you hear me out and you don't agree with what I'm showing you, I walk back out and we proceed the way we've been proceeding." She paused again. "But you're going to want to hear it." The silence on his end lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. "What time?" he said. 9. "Come to the front," he said. "Don't bring your father's people to my door." "I'll come alone," she said. "Have Bernard in the house, not somewhere else. Here." Another pause. "Why?" "Because I want to look at him and confirm he's not hurt," she said. "And because what I'm showing you tonight involves him, and you both need to be in the room." She kept her voice completely level. She was performing nothing. This was the voice she used when she was most serious, stripped of all inflection, because inflection was a resource she couldn't afford to spend on emphasis when the content had to carry itself. 9 o'clock, Dante." She hung up. The security man to her left looked at her. She said, "I need a car to Brooklyn Heights at 8:30. He nodded and got on his radio. She used the next 4 hours to prepare. Not emotionally, she had moved past the point where emotional preparation was a discrete activity rather than a continuous background process. She prepared operationally. She went through the documents she was bringing. She called Halverson's office and left a detailed message about the 3-page Fenwick extract that Victor was delivering. She ate something. A sandwich from a deli. 2 blocks from where the car had stopped, eaten standing at the counter, because sitting felt like a posture she couldn't afford. The food was unremarkable, and she consumed it with the focused indifference of someone refueling rather than eating. At 6:15, Victor called. Bernard was out. Victor's secondary contact had reached him through an indirect channel. A person who knew a person, the particular social infrastructure of a city that contained, alongside all its ordinary business, a parallel city of careful arrangements. Bernard was not hurt. He was in a car heading to a location Victor specified, and the 3 people who had been at his house in Queens were, as of 40 minutes ago, no longer at the house in Queens. Whether this was because they had moved Bernard voluntarily or because Victor's people had applied some form of pressure that the call did not detail, she didn't ask. "Foss," she said. "I have the Southern District filing," Victor said. "My person found it in 40 minutes. It's exactly what I thought it was." He paused. "Foss is considering." "Tell him about Reyes," she said. "Tell him a woman is dead. Tell him what Dante did this morning and what Dante is going to keep doing if the legal architecture supporting his maneuvering stays in place." She paused. "And tell him I'm going to the house at 9, and that if he wants to be part of the resolution of this rather than the instrument of its continuation, the address is in Brooklyn Heights." She heard Victor relay this, muffled, to someone else in the room. Then he came back. "He says he needs an hour." "He has 2, she said. At 8 o'clock she changed. She had 1 change of clothes at Gramercy. She had packed it 18 months ago, a deliberate contingency, the same way she had memorized the number she'd called from the moving car. Dark slacks, a gray blouse, flat shoes. She stood in the bathroom of the Gramercy apartment and looked at her face in the mirror. The bruise along her jaw had deepened to a color that was somewhere between purple and brown, distinct and visible. Not something that could be minimized with whatever was available in the bathroom cabinet. She left it. She looked at it for 3 seconds, and then she turned off the bathroom light and went to get her coat. The car dropped her on the block at 8:52. She walked the rest, half a block, in the cold, with the document case under her arm and no security team within visible distance, which was the agreement and which she had calculated as manageable given that Dante needed her functional tonight more than he needed her otherwise. She walked to the front door of the Brooklyn Heights house and rang the bell. The door was opened by a man she recognized, not one of Dante's regulars, someone she had seen twice before in contexts that told her he was from Brick's side of the operation. He looked at her face and then at the document case and stepped back without speaking. She went in. The house was quieter than she had ever heard it. The specific quality of a large house with very few people in it, sounds carrying further than they should, the particular acoustic of empty rooms. The entrance hall was the same as it had always been, black and white tile, dark wood banister, the oil painting of a harbor scene on the left wall that Dante had bought because an advisor told him it was an investment and that he had never looked at once in 4 years of it hanging there. Dante was in the library. She knew before she reached the door, could hear the particular silence of someone sitting very still in a room. She opened the library door. He was in the chair behind the desk, his father's chair. He looked like he had been sitting there for a long time, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, the specific dishevelment of a man who has been moving through a crisis for 36 hours without adequate sleep. He looked at her when she came in. His eyes went immediately to the bruise on her jaw, and she watched the scene of it land on him with a complexity she didn't spend time analyzing. Bernard Chu was in a chair near the window. He was 66 years old, compact, with gray hair and the hands of someone who had spent decades working with paper and systems rather than physical things. He looked at Elena when she entered with the steady, calibrated calm of someone who had made a decision about how to conduct himself in this room and was maintaining it. He was not hurt. She looked at him long enough to confirm this, and he gave her a small nod that confirmed it back. "Close the door," Dante said. She closed it. She set the document case on the side table near the entrance. She did not sit. "You said you were showing me something," Dante said. "Yes." She looked at him. "First, I need to know something. The man in the Bronx, the one you called from the car yesterday morning, was Reyes the only call you made to him?" Dante looked at her. "Why?" "Because the answer affects what I'm about to show you," she said, "and because I need to know what I'm dealing with before I put anything on this table." She held the look. "Was it only Reyes?" "Yes," he said. She believed him. Not because she had any objective reason to, but because she had spent 6 years learning the specific quality of Dante's lies versus his truths, and this had the texture of truth, flat, without the slight excess of affect that accompanied his dishonesty. "Okay," she said. She went to the document case. She opened it and removed not the Fenwick documentation, but a separate folder, smaller, 8 pages, the thing that had been in the case since she packed it 14 months ago and had not been part of any conversation she'd had with Victor, because this was the piece she had built alone, without telling anyone. She put it on the desk in front of Dante. He looked at it. He didn't touch it immediately. He looked at the cover page. No label, just a date from 11 months ago at the top corner. "What is this?" he said. "It's a full accounting of Raymond Foss's involvement with your organization," she said. "Not just the legal architecture consulting, the earlier material, the 2016 transaction, the Second Circuit period, the specific matters that give you the leverage you've been using." She paused. "Everything." He looked up from the folder. Something had shifted in his face. "You knew about Foss," he said. "I've known about Foss for 11 months, she said. I've had this material for 8. She looked at him steadily. "I didn't use it because using it would have required exposing the full scope of the leverage arrangement, which would have destroyed Foss's ability to function as anything useful to anyone going forward, including us." She let that sit for 2 seconds. "I've changed my mind about that." The room was very quiet. Bernard was watching from the window chair with the stillness of someone who understood that what was happening in this room was not about him, but that he was a necessary witness to it. "Why are you bringing this to me?" Dante said. His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not fear, not quite, but the precursor to fear, the moment before a person's defenses complete their assessment of something and decide whether it warrants the full physiological response. "Because Raymond Foss is going to be at this address in the next 20 minutes, she said. "And I want you to hear from him directly what the legal architecture of your current position actually looks like, not the version Fitch has been building, which assumes that the Fenwick restructuring is your primary protection. The real version." She put her hand flat on the desk. "The version that accounts for the fact that a woman is dead, that Bernard is sitting in that chair because your people put him there, and that the federal contact my father established, which Fitch's source inside that office has been monitoring, is still a federal contact, and the information that's been transmitted through it is already in a place that doesn't come back." Dante stood. He did it suddenly. The way people stand when sitting has become physically impossible. And he put both hands on the desk and leaned forward, and she didn't move back. She stood her ground and looked at him from 18 inches away, and felt her heart doing something loud and fast in her chest that she was not going to let reach her face. "You don't run this," he said. "No one's running anything," she said. "That's the point. It's done, Dante. The structure of what you've built, the political cover, the financial architecture, the legal protection, it's been coming apart since yesterday morning, and it's not going to stop coming apart." She kept her voice completely even. "Foss is coming here to tell you the same thing I'm telling you, because he's free to tell you now, and because what I have in that folder removes the leverage that's been keeping him from telling you the truth." She paused. "You have one decision left that's actually a decision. Everything after this is consequence." He looked at her. His jaw was working. She could see the muscle in it moving, the grinding quality of a man holding himself at the edge of something. "You think you've won this," he said. "I think Carlo Reyes is dead," she said. "And I think Bernard is sitting in that chair because you put him there. And I think the person standing in front of you has spent 3 years making sure that none of what you've done disappears." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I haven't won anything. I've survived you. Those are different things." The doorbell rang. Dante's head turned toward the door. An involuntary movement, the reflex of a man who has not been expecting visitors and who has, in the last 30 seconds, understood what the visitor is likely to be. His hand moved off the desk. "Don't," Elena said. He looked at her. "Don't send your man to turn him away," she said. "Let him in. Hear him out." She held the look. "You asked me to come here tonight. You opened the door. That means you're not entirely sure you have this right. If you were sure, you wouldn't have let me in." She paused. "So hear him out." The doorbell rang again. Dante looked at the door. He looked at Elena. He looked at Bernard in the window chair, who met his gaze with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided that fear is not useful in this room and has put it somewhere else for the duration. Then he called out, "Let him in." The sound of the front door. Footsteps in the entrance hall. The library door opened. Raymond Foss was 63, and he looked, in person, like the specific kind of man who had spent decades in rooms where decisions were made. Not the rooms where those decisions were announced, but the rooms where they were actually made, the smaller rooms, the quieter ones. He was not physically imposing. He was dressed in a dark coat over a suit, and he carried a briefcase, and he moved into the library with the measured pace of someone who has decided how they are going to conduct themselves in this room and has made that decision irrevocable. He looked at Dante. He looked at Elena. He looked at Bernard. "Dante," he said. "The same quality as Victor. Names as complete statements." "Ray," Dante said. Something had happened to his voice. The stripped-down quality of a man whose prepared positions have been removed one by one until what's left is just the voice. "Elena has given me something," Foss said. He set the briefcase on the side table and opened it and removed a folder, different from Elena's, thicker, structured differently. He put it on the desk between them. "It resolves a matter that has been constraining my ability to give you honest counsel." He looked at Dante steadily. "I've been giving you constrained counsel for 18 months. I should have found another way to resolve this sooner. I didn't. That's on me." He put his hand on the folder. "What I'm going to tell you now is unconstrained." Dante looked at the folder. He looked at Foss. He looked at Elena. She watched him decide. She watched the calculation run. What Foss being here meant. What Elena having the Foss material meant. What unconstrained counsel from the man who understood the legal architecture of his entire operation meant in the context of the last 36 hours. "Tell me," Dante said. Foss sat. He opened the folder. He looked at the first page with the focused attention of a man who has prepared this presentation and is delivering it without the luxury of softening. "The Fenwick restructuring Fitch executed this morning creates ambiguity at 3 points," he said. "That ambiguity was intended to make the federal documentation Elena and her father have compiled inconclusive. The problem," he turned a page, "is that the restructuring itself is a documentable act. The timing of it, 6 hours after a public incident at the Whitmore Gala, 3 hours after a confrontation at a Chelsea building, 1 hour after a woman was found dead in a Midtown parking structure. The timing makes the restructuring an overt act of evidence tampering." He looked up. That is not ambiguity. That is a separate federal exposure that didn't exist 24 hours ago. The room was very still. The Calumet holding, Foss continued. Elena's documentation of the routing chain has 3 points of vulnerability that Fitch identified. 2 of them are genuinely ambiguous after this morning's restructuring. One of them, he turned another page. One of them is not. The routing verification for the 3rd quarter of last year. That record exists in 3 separate locations, 2 of which are outside any restructuring Fitch can touch. He set the page down. That record alone is sufficient for a federal filing that proceeds regardless of the ambiguity in the rest of the chain. Dante had not moved in 4 minutes. He was sitting very still in his father's chair with his hands flat on the desk and his face doing something that Elena had no name for, something that was moving through the territory beyond anger, beyond calculation, into a place that she had not seen on him before. "How long?" Dante said. "Before a filing." Foss looked at his folder. If the AUSA moves on the Calumet verification alone, without waiting for the full package, 72 hours. Possibly less, given the timing creates urgency. He paused. There is also the matter of Bernard Chu, who is sitting in that chair because people associated with your organization placed him there. That is a federal matter independent of the financial documentation. It has its own timeline. "What do you recommend?" Dante said. Foss looked at him for a long moment. "I recommend," he said carefully, "that you speak with Gerald Fitch tonight and instruct him to cease all restructuring activity, that any further restructuring is a compounding exposure rather than a mitigation." He looked at his folder. "I recommend that the matter of Mr. Chu be resolved immediately and completely, with full documentation that his presence here was voluntary." He looked up. "And I recommend that you retain separate criminal defense counsel in the morning, not Fitch, someone who has not been involved in the operational decisions of the last 36 hours. "And Elena," Dante said. Foss looked at her. She looked back at him. "Mrs. Moretti's choices are her own," Foss said. "I can only tell you what the legal landscape looks like from where you're standing." He paused. "From where you're standing, attempting to further constrain her choices is the highest risk action available to you." The silence in the library had a specific weight. Elena could hear the house around them, the distant sound of the man at the door moving somewhere in the entrance hall, the settling sounds of an old building in cold weather. Dante looked at Bernard. Bernard looked back at him with the same steadiness he'd maintained since Elena came through the door. "You can go," Dante said to Bernard. His voice was flat. Not an apology. Dante did not have the architecture for apology, but flat in a way that was, for him, the nearest available substitute. Bernard stood. He looked at Elena. She gave him the same small nod he had given her when she came in. He picked up his coat from the arm of the chair, and he walked to the library door, and he left. Elena watched Dante watch Bernard leave. She watched the library door close. Then Dante looked at her. He looked at her with the full, unmediated quality of a man who has had all of his intermediate filters removed. The anger, the calculation, the pride, the paranoia, all of it stripped back by 60 minutes of information, arriving at a pace and depth that his usual defenses couldn't process fast enough to maintain their function. What was left underneath was something she had not seen before, something rawer than what she usually saw, something that looked uncomfortably like the face of a person rather than the face of a position. "The night at the gala," he said. His voice was different, lower. "When you walked away from the table." She waited. "You already knew," he said. "All of it. Foss, the Calumet verification. You had already built the whole thing." "Yes," she said. "And you sat at that table with me for 3 hours." "Yes." He looked at his hands. "Why did you come here tonight?" he said. "The real reason. Not the Foss thing. You could have had Foss talk to me without being in this room. Why are you here?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the car, and in the Gramercy apartment, and in the deli eating the unremarkable sandwich, and she had arrived at an answer that was true in the way that uncomfortable things are true. Not comfortable, not clean, but accurate. "Because I needed you to see it happen," she said. "Not hear about it, see it. The whole picture, Foss, the documentation, Bernard walking out of this room. I needed you to see it in front of you rather than have it arrive as a legal process while you were somewhere else." She paused. I needed you to understand that I'm not trying to destroy you. I never was. I'm trying to get out. And the fastest way to get out completely and permanently is for you to understand, in a room, looking at it, that there is no version of fighting this that ends in a way you survive intact. He looked at her for a long time. The bruise, he said. Yes, she said. I'm not going to. I don't. He stopped. He pressed his lips together. He was not a man who had language for this territory. She had known that from the first year. It was not an excuse. It was a fact about the specific architecture of who he was. Dante, she said. She said it the way you say a name when you want the person it belongs to stop talking and listen. I need 3 things from you, tonight, before I walk out of this house. She looked at him steadily. First, you call the man in the Bronx and you tell him his services are no longer required in relation to anything connected to me, my father, or anyone associated with us. She paused. Second, you call Fitch tonight and you tell him what Foss told you, no more restructuring. She paused again. Third, tomorrow morning you make an appointment with the attorney Foss recommends, and you cooperate with that attorney's guidance, whatever it is. He looked at her. And if I do those 3 things, then I walk out of here tonight and we don't see each other again until we're in a lawyer's office discussing terms. She held the look. I'm not going to add to the federal filing beyond what I've already provided, unless you give me a reason to. The Calumet verification goes to the AUSA with or without my addition. That's already in motion, and I can't stop it, and wouldn't if I could. But everything else I have, she touched the document case, I hold, and I use it only if you come at me or my father or anyone connected to us. You're offering me a margin, he said. I'm offering you the smallest possible version of a future, she said, which is more than you offered Carla Reyes. The room held that for a long moment. Foss had not moved from his chair during any of this. He sat with his folder closed on his lap, and his face in the neutral expression of a man who is present as a witness rather than a participant, which was, Elena thought, exactly the right understanding of what his role was tonight. Dante looked at the desk. He looked at his father's desk with the expression of a man taking an accounting of something that extends beyond the immediate room, some longer inventory, some assessment of how a person arrives at a specific chair in a specific room at a specific point in their life, and what that arrival means about the choices that preceded it. He picked up his phone. He made the call to the man in the Bronx. Elena listened to the call without looking at him, looked instead at the oil painting on the wall that Dante had never looked at, the harbor scene with the gray water and the boats, and the light that was neither dawn nor dusk, but somewhere in between. She listened to Dante say what needed to be said in the flat, stripped language of a man who had removed himself from the position of someone with options and was operating from the position of someone making a single necessary move. He hung up. He set the phone on the desk. Fitch, she said. He made the second call. She listened to this one too. Fitch's voice was audible from across the desk, the high controlled pitch of a lawyer receiving instructions that contradicted the instructions of the last 12 hours. She heard Fitch push back once. She heard Dante say, "Gerald, stop." And she heard Fitch stop. Dante hung up. He looked at her. The third thing, she said. The attorney. In the morning, he said, I need you to say it specifically. His jaw tightened. She watched him hold the tightening and then release it. In the morning, he said again, I'll call whoever Foss recommends. She looked at Foss. Foss gave a single nod, small, confirming. She picked up the document case. She put on her coat. She looked at Dante one last time, looked at him the way you look at something for the last time when you know it's the last time, with the specific quality of attention that finalizing a thing requires. He was 51 years old. He looked older tonight. He looked, she thought, exactly like what he was. A man who had built an empire on the assumption that the people around him were either loyal out of love or compliant out of fear, and who had never once considered that the most dangerous person in any room was someone who was neither. She walked to the library door. She opened it. She stopped with her hand on the door frame. She did not turn around. She said, the painting behind the desk, the harbor scene. She paused. It's worth a lot more than whoever told you it was worth. Have someone look at it. She paused again. It's the only good thing in this room. Then she walked through the door and down the entrance hall and out the front door of the Brooklyn Heights house. And she stood on the front step in the November cold for exactly 3 seconds, breathing the air and feeling the full weight of the last 36 hours pressing on her from all sides. And then she started walking. The car was where the security team had left it, half a block away. She reached it and got in, and the door closed, and the city moved past the windows on both sides. And she sat in the back with the document case on her lap, and her hands in her lap, and the bruise on her jaw, and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding a very specific kind of tension for a very long time, and has just, for the first time, felt it begin to release. Her phone buzzed. "Victor," she answered. "Bernard is safe," he said. "I know," she said. "I watched him leave." A pause. "How did it go?" She looked out the window. The Manhattan Bridge was ahead of them, lit against the dark, its cables catching the light in a way that made them look, for a moment, like something drawn rather than built. "It went," she said. "Foss?" "He was exactly what you said he was," she said, "when he wasn't constrained." "And Dante?" She pressed her fingers against the bruise on her jaw. Not the mapping gesture from the night before, something different, something that was closer to acknowledgement than assessment. "He made the calls," she said. "All three." Victor was quiet for a moment. "Elena." He said her name in the specific way he had said it since she was a child. Not a summons, not an emphasis, but a kind of check-in, a way of saying I'm here without saying it directly. "I know," she said. "Come in tonight. Don't go back to Gramercy." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. She hung up. She looked out the window at the bridge cables and the dark water beneath them and the city opening up on the other side. And she thought about Carla Reyes, and she thought about Bernard in that chair, and she thought about Raymond Foss sitting in a library telling the truth after 18 months of being prevented from telling it, and she thought about a harbor painting that Dante had never once looked at hanging behind the desk where he sat in his father's chair. She thought, it's not over yet. One more thing needed to happen. One more piece of what she had built needed to be put in place. The piece she hadn't told Victor about. The piece she hadn't told anyone about. The call she'd made from the moving car to the number she'd memorized 14 months ago and never used until today. The package that was being delivered to the Brooklyn Heights address before 9 o'clock. Not to Dante. To the address. She had arranged for it to be left with the building's secondary entrance, the one that opened onto the side street, the one that didn't have cameras she hadn't been able to account for. The package contained one thing, a complete copy of every document in the document case, every annotation, every piece of the Fenwick chain and the Calumet routing and the organizational map she had drawn in pencil on legal paper. A complete copy, addressed to Peter Halverson's office, with a cover letter that she had written 6 weeks ago and updated twice since. The cover letter specified that the package was to be opened in the event that Elena Vale failed to make personal contact with Halverson's office by 10 o'clock the following morning. She was going to make that contact. But Dante didn't know about the package. And Dante didn't know about the cover letter. And what that meant, what it had always meant, what it was the purpose of, was that every call Dante had made tonight, every concession he had made in that library, had been made in a room where the consequence of reversing those concessions already existed independently of anything Elena did or didn't do next. She had not told him this. She had not needed to. The car moved through the city, and Elena looked at the lights going past and felt the document case under her hands, and thought about tomorrow morning and the attorney's office, and the specific quality of a morning that arrives after the longest night of a thing that has been a very long time ending. She was not done, but she was close enough to done that the distance, finally, felt measurable. Marco has been making his own calculations for 22 years, she said. Whatever Marco decides to do, he's deciding for reasons that have nothing to do with me. I'm not going to manage Marco's choices. Victor nodded. He looked at his desk. He picked up a pen and set it down. A gesture so small and unconscious that she knew, from 40 years of watching him, that it meant he was about to say something he had been holding. I owe you an accounting, he said. She looked at him. The things I withheld, he said. Reyes, Foss, the surveillance on Carver. I was managing the operation the way I've always managed things. Compartmentalized, controlled, distributing information on a need-to-know basis. He looked at her. You were inside his house. You were the person carrying the highest level of daily risk, and I was giving you less than the full picture because I thought I was protecting you. He paused. I was wrong. The partial picture created gaps that cost us Reyes. That's not a conclusion I can reason my way around. She looked at him for a long moment. I know why you did it, she said. I know you do. That's not the same as it being the right call. No, he said. It's not. They sat with that. The office was very quiet. Outside the windows, Midtown Manhattan went about its afternoon. The indifferent machinery of the city continuing its operation regardless of what had been resolved or destroyed or survived within it over the last 48 hours. I found out her mother's name, Elena said. Victor looked at her. Reyes. Her mother's name was Angela. She died 12 years ago. She had the certified copy in her pocket. She didn't take it out. I want to find out if there's family. I want to make sure they know what she did. She paused. And I want to make sure that whatever compensation is appropriate is handled. Whatever Reyes was being paid for her cooperation, if it wasn't enough, I want it to be enough now. For whoever is left. Victor held her gaze. I'll find the family, he said. I'll handle the compensation, she said. That comes from me. Not from the operation, not from any fund associated with this case. From me. He nodded. He understood the distinction. She picked up the coffee Daniel had brought her. It had cooled enough to drink, and she drank it slowly, both hands around the cup, letting the warmth move into her palms. She thought about what Halverson had said about testimony, about the end of this not being private. She thought about what it meant to have a public record of what your marriage had been, what it meant for other people to read, in a legal document, the account of 6 years of a specific kind of surviving. She thought, let them read it. If one person reads it and understands something about their own situation that they hadn't had language for before, then the public nature of it serves something beyond the legal process. This was not a decision she had arrived at easily. It was a decision she had arrived at over many months, revised and reconsidered and ultimately confirmed, and she was not going to revisit it now. What happens next? Victor said, not directing, asking. Halverson manages the separation proceedings. The AUSA manages the criminal exposure. Foss's account goes wherever it's most useful. She set the coffee cup down. Dante retains the criminal defense attorney Foss recommended, which means Dante has someone advising him whose primary interest is minimizing his exposure through cooperation rather than through obstruction. Which means the people the AUSA wants information about, the political contacts, the financial intermediaries, the people further up the chain who Dante has been facilitating, those people become accessible through Dante's cooperation in a way that's more useful to the federal case than anything in my documentation. Victor looked at her. You planned for this. I planned for the possibility of it, she said. It required Dante to make a specific set of choices last night. He made them. She paused. I didn't know he would. I thought he probably would once he had Foss in the room and no restructuring option left, but I didn't know. What if he hadn't? Then the package Halverson has goes to the AUSA directly, and we have a longer, messier process that produces a less complete result. She looked at the window. Reyes still has her name in the record regardless of which version it was. Bernard is still safe. The Calumet verification is still filed. She paused. Some of what I built works no matter what Dante does. The rest required him to make specific choices. He made them. Victor was quiet. Then, you've been thinking about this for a long time. 3 years, she said. No. He shook his head slowly. Longer than that. You've been thinking about this kind of problem, how to get out of a situation that's designed to keep you in, for longer than 3 years. He paused. You were 17 the first time I watched you work through something like this. Your mother was sick, and there was a decision about her treatment, and the doctors were giving us information in a way that was designed to limit our options. And you sat at the kitchen table and mapped the whole thing out on paper. Every variable, every dependency, every point where the structure had an opening. He looked at her. I was so proud of you I couldn't speak. She looked at him. I should have said it then, he said. I should have said it more since. She set down the coffee cup. She looked at her father, 68 years old, gray-haired, sitting in his office chair with the contained precision he had carried through 40 years of building and losing and rebuilding, the man who had flown from Rome with a black folder and walked into a ballroom at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night and changed the direction of what was going to happen, and who had also withheld things and made decisions without consulting her, and been wrong in specific ways that had cost a woman her life. Both of those were true. Both of them were him. "I know," she said. "I know you're proud." She stayed at Victor's office until 5. They went through the remaining logistics, the timeline for the AUSA, the separation proceedings, the communication protocol with Halverson, the matter of the Brooklyn Heights house, and what would need to happen with it, the question of where Elena would be living for the next several months while proceedings moved forward. She would stay at the Upper East Side apartment. Victor had already spoken with his building manager. The apartment was available indefinitely. She left at 5:15. She took a cab, not the security team, not a car Victor arranged. A regular cab, hailed on the street, paid in cash, in which she sat in the back and watched the city in the early dark of November, and felt the difference between this cab ride and every cab ride she had taken over the last 3 days. The difference was not dramatic. It was internal. It was the specific difference between carrying something and having set it down, not the absence of weight, because the weight was still there and would be there for a long time, but the shift from active carrying to something more like acknowledgement. I had this. I carried it. It is no longer the primary thing I am doing. She asked the driver to stop 2 blocks before the apartment building. She got out and walked the remaining 2 blocks slowly. She was not rushing toward anything. She had nowhere to be until tomorrow morning and no task running that required her immediate attention, and this was a condition so unfamiliar to her current nervous system that she had to consciously slow herself down, had to remind her body that the pace could change now, that the pace was allowed to change. She walked. She looked at the city around her, the brownstones, the restaurants beginning their dinner service with warm light in their windows, the people on the sidewalk moving with the purposeful speed of a cold evening. She looked at all of it with the particular quality of attention that arrives when you have been inside something consuming for a long time, and then step outside of it and find the ordinary world still there, unchanged, going about its business. She thought about the harbor painting, the one behind Dante's desk that he'd never once looked at. She thought, I wonder if he looks at it now. She didn't know. She wouldn't know because she would not be in that room again. That was one of the concrete facts of what had been decided, and it was a fact she was not mourning. What she noticed, walking down the block, was that the absence of mourning was its own kind of information, that 6 years of a life, even a life that had required the specific kind of management hers had required, left something when it ended, even when the ending was right. Not grief exactly, not regret exactly. Something that was simply the weight of time spent, acknowledged, and set down. She reached the building. She went upstairs. She unlocked the apartment door and went in and turned on the lights in the kitchen and stood in the lit kitchen for a moment doing nothing. Then she went to the small table near the window and she sat down and she opened the document case for the last time. She took everything out and laid it on the table. Every page, the Fenwick chain, the Calumet routing, the organizational map in pencil on legal paper, the 8-page FOSS folder, the annotated copies with the red marks. She arranged it on the table in front of her and looked at it. 30 months. Reduced to a table covered in paper. She thought about the woman who had assembled this, who had sat in rooms that were not safe and conducted conversations that required absolute precision and built this page by page, piece by piece, while making dinner and attending events and sleeping beside a man who she was afraid of and who had no idea what was being built around him. She thought about that woman with a kind of detached compassion, the way you feel compassion for a version of yourself that has been through something you are no longer in. She had not been invulnerable. She had been afraid, consistently and specifically, for 3 years. She had made mistakes. She had misread Reyes. She had underestimated the federal source exposure. She had built a plan around conditions that partially failed to hold. She had been, throughout, a person with limits operating at the edge of those limits and sometimes past them. She had also built something that held, that was doing what it was supposed to do. That was in the 48-hour window the AUSA had described, going to finish resolving itself into a permanent change in the landscape. She took the organizational map, the pencil one, the hand-drawn one, the one she had revised 7 times over 30 months as the picture clarified, and she folded it carefully and set it aside. She was keeping this one, not as evidence, as a record of what sustained attention looked like when applied to a problem that mattered. Everything else she stacked neatly. In the morning, she would deliver it to Halverson's office as the final supplementary materials to accompany the case documents he already had. She made dinner. It was a simple thing: pasta, olive oil, some of the food Victor's apartment kept stocked. She stood at the stove and cooked it, and ate it at the kitchen table by the window with the folded organizational map on the table beside the plate, and she looked out the window at the Upper East Side street and the lit windows of the buildings across from her and felt the evening move around her with the ordinary, enormous indifference of a city that had contained within it, and would continue to contain, the full range of what people were capable of doing to each other and for each other and despite each other. 3 weeks later, Dante Moretti entered a cooperation agreement with the AUSA's office. The agreement was the result of 12 days of negotiation conducted by the attorney Raymond Foss had recommended, a woman named Judith Crane, who had spent 20 years in federal criminal defense, and who was, by all accounts, precisely as good at her job as Foss had implied. The agreement covered the Fenwick routing, the Calumet holding, the political relationships Tommy Vitale had provided detailed accounts of, and 3 additional matters that emerged from the Foss disclosure that Elena had not known about. In exchange for full and documented cooperation, Dante's criminal exposure was significantly, though not entirely, reduced. He was not free. He was never going to be free, in the sense that the life he had built was permanently dismantled, and the name he had built was permanently associated with the cooperation agreement and everything it disclosed. His political contacts were investigated, several of them formally charged. His financial network was restructured under federal oversight. The waterfront operation Sal Greco had managed ended. The Red Hook building was seized. Elena knew these things because they were public record, because they appeared in news coverage that she read in the same way she had read everything for 3 years, with the systematic attention of someone who understood that information lived in details rather than headlines. She did not follow it closely. She followed it the way you monitor the weather after a storm has passed, not anxiously, not with investment in the outcome, but with the practical awareness of someone who lives in the landscape the storm has changed. She was not present for any of it. She was at the Upper East Side apartment, and then she was at a different apartment she found in March, smaller, in the West Village, with a kitchen window that looked out onto a courtyard and a building full of people she didn't know and didn't need to know, which was the specific quality of anonymity she had been craving for 3 years without knowing what to call it. The separation proceedings moved slowly, because they always move slowly when the assets involved require forensic accounting, and because Judith Crane, who was managing Dante's side of it, was thorough in ways that extended the timeline while ultimately accepting outcomes that Halverson was satisfied with. Elena received, at the end of the proceedings, what was legally and documentably hers: the assets from the Vale family trust that had been in her name before the marriage, the investments she had made independently, and a settlement that Halverson described as appropriate and that Elena had not argued about, because the settlement was not the point and had never been the point. She found Carla Reyes's family in February, a younger sister named Rosa, living in Queens, who had not known the full scope of what Carla had been doing in the last 2 years, but who had known enough. Had known that Carla had made a decision about something and had been carrying it, to receive the account Elena gave her without being destroyed by it. They met at a coffee shop in Astoria on a Tuesday afternoon. Elena told Rosa what Carla had done and what it had contributed to and what it had cost. She told her in plain, direct language, without minimizing and without dramatizing, and Rosa sat across from her with a coffee cup she didn't drink from and listened. When Elena finished, Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She always said she was going to do something that mattered. I didn't know what she meant." She paused. "Now I know." Elena transferred the compensation to a bank account Rosa provided. It was enough to constitute a meaningful difference. It was not enough to constitute equivalent value, because there was no amount that constituted equivalent value, and pretending otherwise would have been a form of dishonesty that Elena was not willing to perform. She told Rosa this. Rosa nodded. They were after that in occasional contact. Not close. The connection was too freighted with what it had originated in to develop into something casual and warm. But Rosa sent a message in April, a brief one, saying that the foundation Elena had established, the Vale Family Foundation, restructured from its dormant state and relaunched with a specific focus on legal resources for women navigating high-conflict separations, had helped a woman in Rosa's building access representation she couldn't have afforded otherwise. Elena read this message sitting at the kitchen table in the West Village apartment with the morning light coming through the courtyard window, and she sat with it for a long time. The foundation had been Victor's suggestion initially. She had expanded it, taken the dormant structure and given it not just resources but direction, building a program that combined legal access with the practical infrastructure that legal access alone doesn't provide: housing support, financial counseling, the specific kind of guidance that comes from people who understand what it means to be trying to leave a situation that has been designed to make leaving impossible. She had hired 4 people by March. She was in the process of hiring 2 more. She ran the foundation the way she had run everything for the last 3 years, with systematic attention to the detail that mattered and the tolerance for complexity that most people found uncomfortable. She was good at it. She was better at it than she had expected to be, partly because the work was not abstract for her, and partly because the women who came through the program recognized, in the particular way that people recognize something that is being offered by someone who has been where they are, that what was being offered was real. She did not talk about her own situation with the women in the program. That was not the exchange. What she offered was not her story. Her story was in the public record, accessible to anyone who wanted to read a federal cooperation agreement and the civil proceedings that had run alongside it, but her attention, her specific, sustained, no shortcuts attention to the problem in front of her. Victor visited the foundation's offices in April. He arrived on a Tuesday morning without calling ahead, which was not how Victor usually operated and which she suspected was deliberate, a way of seeing the place in its ordinary state rather than its prepared state. He stood in the entrance and looked at the space and at the people working in it, and at the bulletin board near the front that had, pinned to it, the foundation's stated purpose in 12 words that Elena had written herself. He stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "Your mother would have—" He stopped. "I know," she said. He came in. She gave him a tour of the small space, the meeting rooms, the legal resources area, the room where the financial counseling sessions happened. He asked questions, good ones, the kind that told her he was genuinely assessing rather than performing interest. She answered them. At the end of the tour, he stood in the main room and looked at the courtyard visible through the back window and said, with the particular quietness of someone saying a thing they have held for a long time, "I'm sorry it took this long." She looked at him. "What took this long?" "This," he said. He gestured, not at the room, she understood, but at the condition of her standing in it. "Getting here." He paused. "I could have been more available in the years before you married him. When things with the business were, I could have been more present." She looked at the window, at the courtyard where a square of cold April sky was visible, pale blue and high and clear. She thought about the simplicity of that sky and the complexity of everything that existed beneath it. "You were where you were," she said. "I made my own decisions." "I know, that's not— I know that." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "I just want to say it." She turned and looked at him. She looked at him the same way she had looked at Dante in the library. The way you look at something for what it is, without the overlay of what you need it to be or what you're afraid it is. Victor Vale, 68 years old, standing in the offices of a foundation he had watched his daughter build out of the wreckage of something he had not been able to prevent, saying the thing he had been holding because he finally understood it was time to say it. "I know," she said. They stood in the quiet of the room together for a moment. Then she said, "Have you eaten? There's a place 2 blocks from here that makes the best brisket I've found in Manhattan." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she hadn't seen on him in a long time. Something light, something that was the specific expression of relief that manifests as humor when a person has been serious for too long about something that has finally, at cost, been resolved. "Lead the way," he said. She picked up her coat. She turned off the light in the main room. She walked through the office and out the front door and onto the West Village street, and her father came out behind her and the door closed, and the April afternoon was bright and cold and full of the ordinary noise of a city that contained within it, as it always did, everything, the terrible and the survivable, and the good that people made out of what remained after the terrible had passed through. She walked a half block before she said anything. Then, Reyes's sister sent me something in March. Rosa, he said. He knew the name. She had told him. Yes, some from her building, one of the women in the program. She put her hands in her coat pockets. She didn't know Carla had worked with us until I told her. But she'd been watching Carla for years, she said, watching her carry something. And she said she knew, that whatever Carla was carrying, it was something that mattered to her, not out of obligation, out of… She stopped. She chose the word carefully. Conviction. Victor walked beside her without speaking. I think about that a lot, she said, whether I'm doing this out of conviction or out of something else. Some need to make the cost mean something that it's not either or, Victor said. You know that. I know, she said. I'm still working out what it is. They walked. The street was bright with midday light, the particular sharp clarity of a spring day that hasn't fully committed to warmth. Around them, the neighborhood moved with the purposeful randomness of a city afternoon. People with coffee cups, and people with children, and people looking at their phones, and people doing nothing in particular, the full ordinary texture of lives proceeding. Elena Vale walked in the middle of it, with her coat and her father beside her and the folded organizational map. Still in the inner pocket of the coat, where she'd put it the night she moved into the West Village apartment and hadn't removed since. And the bruise on her jaw long healed and invisible now, no trace remaining on the surface. She kept the map not because she was still building a case. The case was done. The case had done what it needed to do. She kept it because it was, she had decided, the most honest object she owned. 30 months of sustained attention, revised 7 times, still legible under all its corrections. Every changed assessment documented in its own specific revision rather than erased. The map of a mind working through something that mattered, visible in all its imperfection, holding together despite the imperfection, which was, she thought, what you asked of any structure you built. She turned at the corner. The restaurant was mid-block, its sign small and the frontage narrow, the kind of place you'd walk past without seeing it if you didn't know it was there. Here, she said. Victor looked at the sign. He looked at her. He said, after you. She opened the door. The warmth of the restaurant came out to meet them. The smell of food and the sound of midday conversation and the specific brightness of a room full of ordinary people having ordinary meals on an ordinary afternoon. She stepped inside.